In the long memory of medieval Europe, some kings rise like giants. Alfred the Great, the scholar-warrior who saved a realm. William the Conqueror, the invader who reshaped it forever. Richard the Lionheart, the crusading symbol of royal courage. Their names echo across the centuries. But tonight, as you settle into a calm breath, we turn not to a legend, but to a king history nearly allowed to disappear. A young ruler whose reign was brief, whose death was sudden, and whose legacy lies hidden in the quiet margins of old chronicles. His name was Edmund, not the martyr saint, not the folk hero of old poems. This Edmund left no epic carved in stone, yet the truth buried in those fading manuscripts is astonishing. Without him, early England might not have survived the decade. Imagine a young king standing alone in a wind-beaten timber hall, a new crown resting on his brow, a crown almost too heavy for any man in his early 20s. Outside, the kingdom trembles like cracked ice. Viking warlords at the borders, rival nobles maneuvering in shadows, alliances shifting like winter wind. If Edmund failed, England would fracture. If he endured, the England we know could be born. But who was he? How did a life so short leave a mark so deep? To understand Edmund's rise, we must first return to the chaos he inherited. England in Edmund's early years was a land caught between storms. Not one invasion, not one war, but waves of them, each reshaping the map, each testing the fragile bonds that held kingdoms together. Anglo-Saxon lords whispered alliances in candlelit halls, tracing boundaries on rough parchment maps lit by trembling flames. Along the coasts, lookouts scanned the horizon, knowing that a single Viking sail meant the start of another desperate season. This wasn't a simple conflict of two sides. It was a shifting tug-of-war where entire regions were pulled between cultures, between rulers, between visions of what England should become. Loyalty was a currency, traded daily. Borders were more rumor than reality. Unity wasn't a lofty dream, it was survival. And somewhere inside this uncertainty, in royal halls that felt more like temporary fortresses than seats of power, grew a young boy named Edmund. For him, this wasn't history, it was the air he breathed. His earliest memories were shaped by caution, vigilance, and the knowledge that nothing stable stayed stable for long. In his world, peace felt like a fleeting visitor. He would grow into a man expected to make sense of this chaos, to bring order to a kingdom where order had never lasted. And though he could not know it yet, the weight of England's fractured future was already quietly settling onto his shoulders. Before Edmund was old enough to understand the weight of his family's past, the House of Wessex already stood as a rising force, a dynasty forged through fire. His great ancestor Alfred the Great had defended England's very soul, holding the line against waves of Viking pressure. Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, didn't just inherit a kingdom, he expanded it, pushing borders outward through a mix of strategy, fortification, and sheer determination. Then came Athelstan, a king whose ambition reshaped the map, uniting lands that had never stood under one crown before. But despite these triumphs, unity was young, delicate, and dangerously reversible. One weak king, one ambitious rebel, one sudden Viking campaign, any of these could unravel decades of hard-won progress. England wasn't yet a finished creation. It was a project still curring, still vulnerable. And towering over all of this history was the question of legacy, a legacy Edmund was born into. For Edmund, these weren't simply stories told in warm halls. They were expectations, standards, the quiet weight placed on a prince's shoulders long before he could speak. Athelstan's unprecedented success set a benchmark that felt almost impossible. Even as a child, Edmund lived in the shadow of a kingdom that demanded greatness from its rulers. His world was not feasts and silk, but maps, marches, and murmured councils by firelight. The creak of wagon wheels at dawn, the smell of wet earth after a long march, soldiers whispering their prayers before battle, these were the sounds and scents of his upbringing. This was the childhood of a future king, shaped not by luxury but by responsibility. Edmund was born into a world that never stopped moving. Royal courts in the 900s were not fixed palaces of marble and ritual. They were mobile hubs of power, shifting from town to town, monastery to monastery, fortified hall to fortified hall. Kings traveled constantly, and their families followed. This meant Edmund's cradle sat not in a single chamber, but in dozens of them. Royal children in the 900s did not grow up behind quiet palace walls. They grew up in the middle of everything. The clatter of retainers preparing to ride at dawn, the rustle of scribes drafting charters by candlelight, the murmured negotiations of nobles arguing over borders and tribute. For Edmund, these sounds weren't interruptions. They were the background music of childhood. He saw oath ceremonies where weather-worn landholders knelt and pledged loyalty to the crown. He watched monks roll out maps stitched with uncertainty, some borders inked, others guessed. He heard the rumble of wagon wheels as the royal party moved before sunrise, frost still clinging to the grass. He learned early that a kingdom was not a single place, but a network of loyalties that needed constant tending. Edmund's earliest memories were formed not in stillness, but in motion. His childhood unfolded on the front lines of a country still being shaped, a childhood woven from travel, tension, ritual, and responsibility. It was an upbringing designed not for comfort, but for the making of a future king. To understand Edmund's world, you must understand the Vikings. Not the Hollywood image of horned helmets and endless raids, but the far more complicated reality. By the time Edmund was growing up, many Scandinavians in England weren't raiders anymore. They were settlers, farmers, craftsmen, rulers, and in some regions, the majority population. The Danelaw, that vast swath of eastern England, wasn't a battlefield so much as a cultural blend. Scandinavian names filled legal documents. Norse customs shaped local governance. Markets buzzed with traders carrying goods from both worlds. Even the languages themselves were starting to mix, creating new dialects that sounded half English, half Norse. But this coexistence did not mean harmony. Loyalty could shift quickly. A region might accept the English king's authority one year, then back a Scandinavian claimant the next. The political landscape was fluid, a hybrid world, neither entirely English nor entirely Viking. This complexity was the air Edmund breathed. He grew up knowing that unity was fragile, authority negotiable, and peace never guaranteed. You could not simply order loyalty, you had to earn it, again and again. And it was into this layered landscape, part English, part Scandinavian, that Edmund would one day have to assert authority. A kingdom still divided, a people still deciding who they were, a crown that demanded uncommon skill. If there was one figure who shaped Edmund's sense of destiny, it was Athelstan, the brilliant, relentless king who became both mentor and measuring stick. Athelstan was not just a warrior, he was a statesman, a diplomat, and a strategist whose vision stretched across the British Isles. Edmund watched his elder brother negotiate with Welsh princes, correspond with Frankish rulers, and host envoys from distant courts. He saw how Athelstan's authority rested not only on armies, but on alliances, marriages arranged, oaths secured, gifts exchanged with precision and intention. But towering success casts a long shadow. To grow up beside such greatness was inspiring and daunting. Athelstan's victories were legendary, his campaigns decisive, his reputation unmatched. His rule set the expectation that a king must be more than competent, he must be extraordinary. Some nobles resented the crown's growing reach, some northern rulers submitted only with clenched teeth. Edmund saw the tension in their eyes during audiences, the uncertainty in their bows. Power won quickly had to be guarded carefully. And Edmund felt all of this, the pride, the strain, the pressure. Athelstan wasn't merely a king he admired. He was a standard he would one day be compared against. At 16, Edmund witnessed a moment that reshaped the fate of Britain. The Battle of Brunanbar. Not from a distant hill or safe encampment, but close enough to smell the churned earth and hear the shudder of shields meeting steel. Brunanburh was no ordinary battle. It was a clash of kings, Athelstan and Edmund on one side, a coalition of Scotland, Strathclyde, and powerful Norse rulers on the other. For a boy just stepping into adulthood, it wasn't merely a military conflict. It was an initiation. He heard the war horns echo across the fields, saw the gleam of axe heads rising and falling, watched messengers sprint between formations with frantic urgency. The lines surged, staggered, reformed. The air shook with fury. But beneath the chaos, Edmund saw something else. The structure, the discipline, the unspoken coordination that separated a kingdom from anarchy. This was what rulership demanded: clarity in confusion, resolve in terror, vision amid violence. When the field finally fell silent and Athelstan stood victorious, Edmund understood something profound. Unity did not survive by accident. It survived because men were willing to bleed for it. Brunanburh didn't frighten him. It awakened him. Victory at Brunanburh was monumental. Poets would celebrate it for generations. But Edmund quickly learned a harsh truth. Victory does not secure peace. It simply buys time. Even as Athelstan's banners were raised across the field, Edmund saw the uneasy looks among some nobles. They had won, yes, but against an extraordinary coalition. And that coalition had not been destroyed, only scattered. Those leaders would return to their lands nursing wounds, resentments, and plans. In the months that followed, Edmund observed a kingdom in motion. Envoys rode in and out of the royal camp. Some brought congratulations, others veiled threats. Borders had shifted, but loyalties had not fully settled. In the north especially, submission was thin, a politeness masking deeper defiance. Edmund listened to the debates in council chambers. Should the crown press harder? Should it offer new terms? Should it prepare for the next inevitable uprising? He learned that ruling meant balancing strength with subtlety, fear with fairness. It was here that Edmund absorbed one of the most difficult lessons of leadership. Even victory demands vigilance. The crown could never rest, because enemies didn't vanish, they simply waited. Athelstan's death in 939 hit like a thunderclap. It came quickly, without warning, at the height of his power. One day he was England's most formidable monarch. The next, the throne stood empty. And emptiness invites danger. Almost immediately, Olaf Guthfrithson, the ambitious Norse Gaelic ruler of Dublin, saw his chance. He crossed the sea and marched into the Danelaw with terrifying speed. Towns opened their gates. Nobles switched allegiance. The unity Athelstan had built began to unravel in days, not months. Edmund, just 18, was thrust into a crisis he had hoped was years away. He had known he would become king, but not like this, and not so soon. The weight of the crown felt heavier than ever, not because of the gold, but because of the expectation attached to it. He stood at the edge of a storm, watching the kingdom fracture, hearing reports of lost territory, feeling the legacy of Alfred and Athelstan pressing down on his shoulders. And yet, the crisis did not break him. It revealed him. This was the moment Edmund's story truly began. When Edmund was crowned king in late 939, he was barely an adult by modern standards. But in his world, 18 was not a boy's age. It was the age of warriors, the age of leaders. Kingship wasn't ceremonial. It was a burden carried daily, publicly, relentlessly. Edmund assumed the throne in a moment of chaos, with Viking forces reclaiming land and rebellious nobles reconsidering their loyalties. He walked into a storm he did not create but was now responsible for calming. Chronicles describe him as intelligent, composed, and surprisingly steady for his age. He didn't rush into reckless battles. He didn't offer desperate compromises. Instead, he began stabilizing the South and Midlands, securing his base of support before turning to reclaim the North. This measured, almost modern style of leadership stands out in an age typically remembered for brute force. Edmund's reign begins not with grand triumph but with careful observation, patient strategy, and deliberate action, qualities that would soon earn him the title, the Magnificent. When Edmund ascended the throne at just 18 years old, he stepped into a storm he did not create. England was trembling, not collapsing, but shaking in ways only a young king with clear eyes could see. Athelstan's death had opened cracks across the kingdom, and enemies were already pouring through them. But Edmund did not break, and he did not panic. He had prepared for kingship his entire life, yet no preparation matched the reality now confronting him. He walked into council halls still echoing with Athelstan's authority. Nobles who had sworn loyalty to his brother now studied Edmund quietly, measuring whether this young man possessed the steel required to lead. Messengers arrived soaked with rain, bringing tidings from Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, every message laced with uncertainty. And yet beneath these pressures Edmund stood steady. He listened. He learned. He refused to be pushed into rash decisions. The weight of the crown tightened around him, but instead of being crushed, he adapted. This was the moment when Edmund's character began to take shape, not in triumph, not in victory, but in the calm he brought to a kingdom trembling around him. England did not collapse when Athelstan died, but it fractured. In the north, cities that had bowed under Athelstan's firm hand now slipped away like water escaping a cracked cup. Lines on maps blurred. Loyalties that once felt solid softened and ran. Yet in the face of this unraveling, Edmund did not lunge north in a desperate bid to reclaim what had slipped away. Instead, he held the center. He understood something that older men with scarred armor often ignored. If the core of the kingdom remained strong, the edges could one day be recovered. If the heart broke, however, nothing would be left to save. So he chose restraint, a quiet, deliberate strength far rarer in medieval kingship than victory itself. He fortified the south. He stabilized the heartlands. He slowed the kingdom's breathing, refusing to let panic spread like rot through timber. While others demanded dramatic gestures, Edmund built stability day by day, council by council. In these early weeks, he revealed a truth about rulership that few kings ever accept. Sometimes survival requires stillness. To understand Edmund's first great challenge, we must understand Olaf Guthfrithson, the king who seized the north. Olaf was no reckless raider. He was intelligent, cunning, and politically fluent. Under his leadership, the Viking-ruled regions of Northumbria were not just military threats, they were diplomatic players. Towns shifted allegiance not from fear alone, but from calculation. Olaf offered protection, coin, autonomy. He was everything medieval English chroniclers feared and reluctantly respected, a king who could rule as effectively as any descendant of Wessex. For Edmund, this was not an enemy to underestimate. Olaf was young, ambitious, and surrounded by advisors who knew the politics of the North far better than most English nobles. If left unchecked, Olaf could redraw the map permanently. But Edmund did not fear Olaf, he studied him. He collected intelligence from merchants, priests, even traveling minstrels. Every rumor mattered. Every whisper revealed something about Olaf's alliances, weaknesses, or ambitions. In these quiet calculations, Edmund showed a new kind of kingship, a ruler who understood that knowledge could be sharper than any sword. While Olaf tightened his grip on the north, Edmund focused his strength where it mattered most, the south. He traveled constantly, a royal court on the move, through Winchester, Bath, Shaftesbury, and the scattered towns that anchored English identity. Everywhere he went, he reaffirmed authority not with threats, but with presence. In Winchester's markets, smoke rose from cookfires at dawn as the king's entourage arrived. In Bath, church bells echoed through wet streets as citizens gathered to catch a glimpse of the young ruler. These weren't grand, triumphal entries. They were reminders that the crown was still watching, still guiding, still whole. Medieval kingship was not a static role. It was movement, negotiation, reassurance. Edmund negotiated disputes, renewed oaths, verified land charters, and reinforced trade networks. The South was his foundation, a rooted strength that allowed the kingdom to breathe through crisis. This work was not dramatic, but it was essential. It was here, in the rhythm of travel and reaffirmation, that Edmund strengthened the pillars that would later support his reconquest. Every king begins his reign with only one true resource: reputation. And Edmund knew that a king without a reputation was a king without a shield. So he listened. He listened to disagreements over fields and grazing rights. He listened to fishermen arguing about access to rivers. He listened to low-born disputes as seriously as high-born negotiations. These moments were not beneath him. They defined him. For ordinary people, a king who listened was a king worth following. This personal attention created something weapons and armies could not: trust. And trust, once earned, becomes a kind of armor, protecting a ruler from rebellion, skepticism, and fear. Through these acts, Edmund separated himself from his predecessors. Alfred had been the defender, Edward the consolidator, Athelstan the conqueror. Edmund was becoming something more subtle, a king who ruled through presence, patience, and principle. Legitimacy wasn't a crown he inherited. It was a foundation he constructed, stone by stone, through human connection. The church was not merely a spiritual institution. It was the nerve system of the kingdom. And Edmund understood this intuitively. He forged strong ties with bishops, abbots, and monastic leaders, recognizing that their support stabilized the emotional heart of the people. One trusted ally emerged above all: Oda, the future Archbishop of Canterbury. Oda was sharp-minded, politically experienced, and deeply respected. He saw promise in Edmund that many nobles overlooked. Monasteries still carried the scars of Viking raids decades earlier. Burned libraries, shattered altars, abandoned settlements. Their fear of further devastation ran deep, and in Edmund they sought protection. By winning the church, Edmund won the confidence of a population still haunted by old nightmares. This alliance did not only bind him to religious authority, it bound him to memory, to the stories people told about their past and the hopes they held for their future. Many medieval rulers lunged at problems. They charged north too quickly, trusted the wrong nobles, or spilled blood to create an illusion of strength. Edmund did none of this. Instead, he practiced something rare in his time: strategic patience. He watched the north carefully. He tracked Olaf's alliances the way a hunter tracks shifting footprints in the snow. He saw the rival king grow bolder and then overstretch. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Olaf's grip loosened as new pressure strained his kingdom. Edmund waited, and the north would eventually give him the opening he needed. This patience wasn't passivity. It was discipline. It was calculation. It was the quiet awareness that reconquest would come not from impulse, but from timing. Here, in these moments of restraint, Edmund proved himself not just a survivor, but a strategist. By the end of his first years on the throne, Edmund had stabilized the south, secured the church, earned the people's trust, and watched his rival begin to weaken. The realm was no longer trembling. It was preparing. England had a young king who understood that leadership was not noise, it was rhythm. And that rhythm was beginning to change. A shift in the north, a misstep by Olaf, a new alliance forming in Edmund's favor. These subtle movements were gathering like storm clouds on a horizon. The time for patience was ending. The time for action was coming. And Edmund, no longer the uncertain young king who inherited a crisis, was ready. Minute 17 suggested visuals: slow build of tension with clouds. Wind over hills, torches being lit in a night encampment, Edmund's silhouette on horseback maps, showing Northern Territory soldiers preparing equipment quietly. As Edmund strengthened his hold on central and southern England, chroniclers began taking note of his leadership style. They wrote of him as calm, disciplined, and deliberate, traits that distinguished him from many warrior kings of the early medieval period. He wasn't reckless or impulsive. He didn't respond to pressure with panic. Instead, he observed, considered, and acted only when necessary. This careful temperament would later define his reign and contribute to his lasting influence. But this wasn't simply personality. It was shaped by his upbringing. Edmund had spent his childhood watching Athelstan govern a realm surrounded by hostile forces. He had seen battles won not only by swords, but by timing. He had seen alliances forged through words rather than bloodshed. And now, as king, he was applying these lessons subtly, consistently, and effectively. His early reign wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, no grand victories or dramatic conquests. Yet beneath the surface, Edmund was becoming exactly the king England needed. We often romanticize medieval kings, imagining them as fearless figures of pure authority. But in reality, kingship carried immense psychological pressure. Edmund, at 18 and 19, faced a world expecting him to be both warrior and statesman. He knew that the mistakes of a single year could undo decades of progress. He knew that enemies watched his every move. And he knew the people of England were judging him not against the average ruler, but against his legendary half-brother Athelstan. This pressure did not break him. It refined him. Chroniclers hint at a king who grew into his role steadily, like tempered steel sharpened through experience. He developed resilience not by avoiding adversity but by living inside it. Kingship wasn't something he inherited. It was something he grew into minute by minute, decision by decision. And while this period of his life rarely appears in grand historical narratives, it was here, in the quiet grind of responsibility, that Edmund the Magnificent was truly forged. By Edmund's second year as king, cracks began to form in Olaf's northern empire. Viking leaders were skilled warriors, but ruling diverse populations required a different kind of finesse. Olaf's rapid conquests had brought disparate groups under his control: Scandinavian settlers, Northumbrian nobles, and local leaders with their own ambitions. Maintaining unity among them was difficult, especially after the initial momentum of conquest faded. Reports began filtering south that disputes had arisen among Olaf's allies. Some resented his policies. Others questioned his long-term plans. This instability was the opening Edmund had been waiting for. But again, he did not act immediately. He knew that the north was still dangerous, and that any premature assault could restore Viking unity. So he watched, he studied, he prepared quietly. Edmund recognized something many rulers of his time did not. Power vacuums don't need to be forced, they often create themselves. Olaf's weakening grip on the north was not Edmund's doing, but Edmund would soon be ready to take advantage. In 941, Olaf Guthfrithson died suddenly, unexpectedly, and at the worst possible moment for Viking control of the north. His death left a power vacuum that threw the region into disarray. Without his leadership, Northumbria fractured. Some factions supported new Viking claimants, others sought English protection. The delicate alliances Olaf had constructed began to crumble almost instantly. For Edmund, this moment was seismic. The obstacle that had prevented him from reclaiming the north was gone. But opportunity is not the same as victory. He needed to move quickly enough to assert control before rival factions regained stability, yet carefully enough to avoid provoking unified resistance. This was Edmund's moment of truth. After years of patience and restraint, his long strategy could finally bear fruit. The young king prepared for the reconquest that would define his reign. With Olaf gone, Edmund initiated a series of calculated military and diplomatic moves to reclaim the north. Instead of launching a massive frontal attack, he advanced gradually, securing towns and strongholds one by one. His armies included not only Anglo-Saxon warriors, but allied Welsh contingents and loyal Mercian forces. This diverse coalition reflected Edmund's strength as a unifying ruler. His first targets were strategic: river crossings, fortified towns, supply routes. Each victory strengthened his position and weakened Viking influence. Edmund's approach was systematic, almost modern in its precision. Instead of seeking glory in battle, he sought stability. Instead of risking everything on one confrontation, he chose endurance. The chroniclers suggest that he personally oversaw parts of the campaign, demonstrating both leadership and tactical awareness. These months marked Edmund's transformation from cautious young king to confident commander. Edmund's reconquest was not won solely by swords. Much of it was achieved through diplomacy backed by military pressure. Northumbrian nobles, long frustrated with Viking rule, found Edmund's return appealing. He offered them something they had not enjoyed under Scandinavian kings: predictable rule and respect for local customs. These nobles had learned that Viking leaders, while fierce in battle, often governed with heavy hands, imposing sudden demands or relocating power centers without consultation. Edmund sent envoys, offered terms, and demanded oaths of loyalty. Many accepted, seeing a chance to restore stability to their lands. Those who resisted found themselves surrounded by Edmund's forces or abandoned by wavering allies. This combination of negotiation and strategic force demonstrates Edmund's balanced leadership. He understood that lasting control comes not from violence alone, but from providing an alternative people want to support. His success here ensured that when the final battle for the North came, the Vikings stood alone. York was more than a city, it was the crown jewel of the North, a place rich with history, trade, and symbolic power. Whoever controlled York controlled the narrative of Northern leadership. When Edmund's campaign reached its climax, it was York that stood as the final objective. Viking forces, though weakened, still defended it fiercely. The battle was not a single-day clash but a prolonged struggle involving skirmishes, blockades, and sieges. Accounts describe Edmund as both determined and restrained. He wanted York, but he did not want to destroy it. He needed its infrastructure intact, its trade thriving, and its people loyal. His strategy reflected this. Rather than razing the city, he applied pressure until Viking forces were forced into retreat. When York finally fell under English control, it marked not only a territorial victory, but the restoration of a dream first envisioned by Alfred and realized briefly by Athelstan, the dream of a united England. By 944, Edmund had reclaimed not only York but the entire northern territory that had once slipped from his grasp. This achievement secured his legacy immediately in the eyes of his contemporaries. He had restored England's unity, not through brute force alone, but through a combination of strategy, patience, diplomacy, and precise military action. Edmund's reconquest demonstrated that he was not simply preserving what had been built, he was actively reshaping the kingdom. With the North restored, England stood more united than ever before. Trade routes reopened. Local rulers reaffirmed loyalty. The boundaries of power solidified. Edmund had taken a fractured realm and made it whole again. His reign could have ended here, and he would still be remembered as a significant king. But this was only the beginning. The next years would reveal a ruler who not only won back lost lands but strengthened the very foundation of English governance. While modern audiences may not instantly recognize Edmund's name, his contemporaries honored him with the title Magnificent. This wasn't empty flattery. It reflected his calm authority, his fairness, his ability to stabilize a turbulent realm, and his success in reclaiming the North without plunging England into prolonged destruction. Magnificence in the medieval sense meant more than grandeur. It meant effectiveness, honor, and visible competence. Chronicles describe Edmund not as boastful or flamboyant, but as steady, thoughtful, and resolute. His greatness was not expressed through dramatic gestures, but through consistent achievement. He was magnificent because he governed magnificently, quietly, intelligently, and with a sense of duty that impressed even those who disliked centralized authority. His reconquest of the North was only one aspect of this. His reforms at home would further justify the title in ways still felt years after his death. After restoring territorial unity, Edmund turned his focus inward. He strengthened legal systems, working closely with Archbishop Oda and trusted advisors to establish clearer, more consistent governance. This involved reaffirming older laws, clarifying punishments for common crimes, and reinforcing protections for church lands and civilian property. In a world where law was often enforced unevenly, Edmund's reforms helped centralize authority and reduce the influence of corrupt or overly ambitious local lords. The Anglo-Saxon legal tradition was deeply community-oriented. It relied on public assemblies, oath-taking, and compensation rather than automatic imprisonment. Edmund respected these traditions but recognized the need for stronger royal oversight. His laws weren't merely punitive, they emphasized stability. They reminded the kingdom that unity required accountability. These efforts may lack the dramatic flair of battles, but they were essential to England's development as a legal and political entity. Many of the principles he reaffirmed would endure long after his death. Edmund's effectiveness as a leader was enhanced by his willingness to trust skilled advisors. Contrary to the stereotype of medieval kings ruling alone, Edmund built a network of competent, educated, and loyal individuals. Archbishop Oda served as moral advisor and legal partner. Mercian leaders offered regional knowledge. Military commanders supported his northern campaigns with tactical experience. This collaborative approach made Edmund's rule sophisticated and adaptable. He listened carefully before acting. He encouraged debate in councils, allowing differing views to influence major decisions. By doing so, he avoided the pitfalls of kings who relied solely on personal instinct. Edmund's court wasn't the most extravagant in Europe, but it was one of the most functionally effective. This understated efficiency, the ability to bring together different voices for a common goal, was one of his greatest strengths. As Edmund entered the middle years of his reign, England stood at the strongest point it had seen in decades. The north was restored, the south was stable, trade routes flourished. Local leaders felt secure under a fair and responsive king. For the first time in years, the kingdom wasn't merely surviving, it was progressing. Edmund's earlier caution had evolved into confident leadership, and the people who had once questioned his youth now recognized him as a capable monarch worthy of the crown. The promise of a new, peaceful era appeared within reach. A kingdom that had been defined by conflict was now defined by rebuilding. Edmund's legacy was no longer tied only to crisis management. He was becoming a king of structure, reform, and long-term vision. But as history often reminds us, stability does not eliminate challenges. It simply changes their form. Edmund's next chapter would bring new complexities, new reforms, and new threats. The year 945 marked a turning point. Edmund was no longer the inexperienced teenager who inherited a broken kingdom. He was now a seasoned king with victories behind him and ambitious plans ahead. Yet the challenges he would soon face would be unlike the ones he had already conquered. Northern reconquest required military and diplomatic skill, but governing a united realm required wisdom, justice, and endurance. At this moment in his reign, Edmund stood on the threshold of his most profound contributions. Reforms that would shape English governance, alliances that would shift the balance of power, and decisions that would echo into the reigns of his sons and successors. The next stage of Edmund's journey would reveal a king who not only saved England, but strengthened it for generations. Our story moves now toward the heart of his legacy, the era of reform, consolidation, and quiet transformation. By Edmund's second year as king, the veneer of unity stretched dangerously thin. What Athelstan had built with brilliance and force now rested on the shoulders of a young sovereign who had inherited not stability but fractures. Across the north, loyalties wavered. In the Midlands, minor lords tested the boundaries of their independence. And always, looming like a dark cloud on the horizon, were the Vikings, never fully defeated, always watching for opportunity. England in the early 940s was not a finished nation, but a patchwork stitched together by oaths, marriages, and memories of stronger kings. Those stitches were loosening. Edmund understood the precariousness, even if the chronicles do not detail every political conversation or whispered warning he heard. His court became a place of constant negotiation. Messages arrived by riders at all hours. Councils convened repeatedly. This wasn't the confident court of Athelstan, but a war room built around an 18-year-old who had to grow up fast. And in this climate, Edmund's reign shifted tone. He was no longer simply reacting to crises. He was preparing to transform them. This is where Chapter 2 of our story begins, the forging of a king in the fires of rebellion and response. When history tells the story of kings, it often focuses on the dramatic battles or decisive treaties, the grand events easily recorded by chroniclers. But the threats that worried Edmund most weren't armies on the horizon. They were the quiet shifts of allegiance happening within England itself. Local lords in Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex had grown used to strong rulers like Alfred and Athelstan. With Edmund young and untested, some sensed opportunity. Not outright rebellion, that would be too risky, but subtle hesitation in paying dues, slow responses to royal summons, private feasts where whispered conversations carried dangerous possibilities. This internal dissent mattered because medieval kingship wasn't like ruling a modern state. There were no police forces, no centralized bureaucracy, no standing army paid directly by the crown. Power relied on reputation, networks of loyalty, and the willingness of nobles to support the king's campaigns. A wavering noble could weaken the entire system. And Edmund recognized this. Before he could march north or confront Viking leaders, he needed to reforge the foundations of loyalty within England. He needed his lords to trust him, to fear him, and ultimately to follow him. His first tests would be political, not military. No king rules alone, and Edmund understood this better than most young monarchs. His court included seasoned advisors who had served his father and half-brother, men who knew the political landscape intimately. Chief among them were his mother, Queen Egifu, a sharp political thinker, and several influential nobles like Oda, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose guidance was essential not only spiritually but administratively. Oda was a master negotiator and deeply familiar with English and continental politics. Edmund relied on him more than most sources openly admit. Additionally, Edmund cultivated alliances with rising nobles in Wessex and Mercia, ensuring that regional leaders saw him as a stable partner rather than a youthful placeholder. But Edmund did something unusual for a king of his age. He listened. Not passively, not deferentially, but strategically. He took counsel seriously, blending the wisdom of older statesmen with his own instincts. This wasn't weakness, it was smart governance. In a realm as fragile as England, gathering the right people around him was as important as winning battles. Edmund's inner circle would eventually become the backbone of his reconquest. When analyzing the instability of Edmund's early reign, we must consider something often overlooked in popular retellings of medieval history. Money, political loyalty wasn't merely ideological, it was financial. Lords needed coin to maintain their estates, warriors, and local defenses. Kings needed coin to fund campaigns, pay for food, support monasteries, and reward allies. When Athelstan died, the economic networks he had established wavered. Trade routes fluctuated. Taxes slowed. Tribute payments from subdued territories became irregular. Economic uncertainty didn't just weaken the treasury. It weakened the entire concept of centralized authority. Edmund recognized this, and one of his earliest moves was to stabilize major trade centers and ensure safe passage along key routes. This wasn't glamorous. It didn't produce legendary poems, but it was essential. By guaranteeing safety for merchants and encouraging the flow of goods, Edmund was quietly reinforcing the idea that loyalty to the crown brought tangible benefits. Lords who hesitated soon realized that a weak king would cost them far more than supporting a young but capable monarch. Through steady economic reinforcement, Edmund began reweaving England's financial web. One of Edmund's greatest early challenges was the North, a region that historically resisted southern authority. Northumbria, especially the city of York, had long-standing Scandinavian ties. Its leaders, customs, and trade networks were connected more to Dublin, Norway, and Denmark than to Wessex. Athelstan had conquered it, yes, but the conquest was recent and fragile. After his death, the region shifted back toward Viking control almost instinctively, as if pulled by gravity. This meant Edmund's kingship in the south wasn't enough. He could claim the title King of England, but as long as York resisted him, the title felt incomplete. Control of the north wasn't merely symbolic, it was strategic. Whoever ruled York controlled access to the North Sea, significant trade income, and influence over Scottish and Irish politics. Losing it meant losing the upper half of the realm. Edmund understood this, but he also understood a crucial truth. Marching an unprepared army north would be a disaster. Instead, he watched, waited, gathered intelligence, and prepared. Patience was his weapon. To understand the North's instability, we must examine Olaf Sitriksson, also known as Olaf Kjuaren, a Viking warlord and king who became Edmund's most formidable early rival. Olaf wasn't a simple raider. He was educated, ambitious, and politically savvy. He had ruling experience in Dublin, had alliances stretching across the Irish Sea, and knew how to exploit moments of English weakness. When Athelstan died, Olaf acted immediately, reclaiming York and consolidating his power before Edmund even had time to respond. Olaf's return brought confidence to the northern factions who preferred Viking rule, not because they despised the English crown, but because they saw Viking leadership as more familiar or more profitable. Trade under Viking networks was brisk, taxation lighter, and cultural ties strong. Olaf positioned himself not as an invader, but as the rightful leader of a region with its own identity. This made him an enemy far more difficult to remove. Edmund wasn't facing a foreign force. He was facing a rival king with legitimate regional support. From 940 to 941, England existed in a tense balance. Edmund held the south, Olaf held the north. Neither ruler had the immediate resources to crush the other. Both sent out spies, both convened councils, both waited for the other to misstep. This period is often glossed over by historians, but it was crucial. Edmund demonstrated remarkable restraint, a trait rare for medieval kings. Instead of launching an emotional, dangerous campaign, he focused on strengthening the south and building alliances. He reinforced ties with Mercian leaders, ensuring the Midlands wouldn't betray him. He maintained positive relations with the Welsh, who had been Athelstan's allies. And importantly, he kept communication lines open with influential northern nobles who were unhappy with Olaf's rule but not yet ready to switch sides. Edmund played a long diplomatic game, understanding that power often shifts not on the battlefield, but in the quiet recalculations of regional leaders. The stalemate wasn't inaction, it was strategy. Mercia, once an independent kingdom, was now central to England's unity. If Mercia stayed loyal, Edmund had a buffer against northern incursion. If Mercia wavered, the entire center of England could fracture. Fortunately for Edmund, Mercian leaders respected the House of Wessex, especially after Alfred and Edward had protected them from Viking expansion. Edmund reinforced this relationship by granting privileges, renewing oaths, and visiting key Mercian sites to demonstrate his commitment. During one of these diplomatic circuits, Edmund received favorable news. Several Mercian nobles, who had feared Viking resurgence, signaled readiness to support military action against Olaf, but only if Edmund could guarantee stability in the south. This was the first shift in momentum. Edmund's patience was paying off. By strengthening his base, he was slowly weakening Olaf's. The Mercian alliance would soon become the launching point for Edmund's northern campaigns. One of the least appreciated aspects of Edmund's character was his diplomatic skill. Chroniclers often describe him as wise or prudent, but rarely do they detail his methods. Yet by reading between the lines, we see a king with an unusually modern political mindset. Instead of relying solely on displays of force, Edmund used negotiation as a tool to limit bloodshed and maintain long-term stability. He sent envoys not only to allies but to potential enemies, clarifying his intentions and offering alternatives to conflict. This wasn't weakness. Kings who negotiated were often more feared because they demonstrated control. Edmund learned from Athelstan that reckless warfare could drain resources, split alliances, and damage the very land he hoped to unify. Thus, Edmund's signature approach was measured engagement. When dealing with rebellious nobles or uncertain territories, he often offered fair terms first, then enforced them decisively if ignored. This combination of diplomacy and firmness would define his upcoming campaigns. By early 942, Edmund made his first cautious push northward. This wasn't a full-scale invasion, but a probing maneuver designed to test Olaf's defenses and gauge the loyalty of local leaders. Edmund's forces entered the southern edges of the Danelaw, a region historically under Viking influence but culturally mixed. The reaction was telling. Some settlements offered supplies, quietly supporting Edmund. Others remained neutral. Only a handful openly resisted. This reconnaissance was a strategic success. Edmund learned the terrain, identified supportive communities, and clarified where Olaf's influence was strongest. Most importantly, he realized that Olaf's control wasn't absolute. Many northern lords were ambivalent about Viking rule. They wanted stability, trade, and predictable taxation. Whichever king provided that would earn their loyalty. Edmund's reconquest wouldn't be simple, but it was increasingly possible. The first seeds of hope had been planted. What Edmund didn't know at the start, but soon discovered, was that Olaf's strength in the north was beginning to erode. Viking politics were complex, often driven by shifting alliances across the Irish Sea. Olaf faced challenges in Dublin, where rival leaders questioned his authority. This split his attention and resources. Holding York required constant presence, but Olaf couldn't be in two places at once. Edmund, through informants and trade networks, learned of these divisions. This intelligence gave Edmund enormous strategic advantage. Instead of confronting Olaf at full strength, he would wait until the Viking king was weakened by external pressures. This wasn't cowardice. It was the essence of good medieval strategy: strike when the balance tilts in your favor. And by mid-942, that tilt was beginning. Olaf was stretched thin. His influence was wavering. And Edmund, watching carefully from the south, was ready. Before advancing north again, Edmund made a critical decision: strengthen the south to the point where no rebellion could erupt behind him during the campaign. He renewed alliances with local rulers, confirmed land grants, and rewarded loyal nobles. This ensured that his army wouldn't march north, leaving a vulnerable political vacuum behind. Edmund's vision was holistic. He didn't simply want to conquer, he wanted to build durable stability. He also invested in the church. Monasteries were not just spiritual centers, they were administrative hubs, record keepers, economic engines, and sources of legitimacy. Supporting monastic communities meant cultivating networks of influence. It ensured sermons praising the king, prayers for his success, and chroniclers documenting his rule favorably. Edmund understood the optics of power. A king blessed by the church carried significant authority in the eyes of the people. And so, before he took on Olaf directly, he secured the ideological battlefield as well as the political one. One of Edmund's most brilliant political moves came when he established contact with Wulfstan, the Archbishop of York, a man with enormous influence over northern leaders. Wulfstan had previously supported Viking rule, but he was pragmatic, not ideological. He wanted stability for his region, and Olaf's weakening position made him reconsider. When Edmund reached out diplomatically, offering protection and autonomy under English overlordship, Wulfstan listened. Their alliance wasn't immediate, but it grew gradually through messengers, envoys, and mutual interests. This relationship would later become one of the foundational pieces of Edmund's reconquest strategy. Securing York spiritually was as important as securing it militarily. If the archbishop shifted his allegiance, many of the northern nobles would follow. Edmund understood that legitimacy was as important as force, and in Wulfstan he found a crucial piece of the puzzle. By late 942, Edmund launched a more assertive campaign into the Danelaw, this time not merely probing but reclaiming territory. The borderlands were fiercely contested. Some towns welcomed Edmund, eager for stability. Others resisted, fearing punishment for previously supporting Olaf. Edmund approached these regions with a dual tactic. He rewarded cooperation generously and responded to resistance swiftly. Battle narratives from this campaign are sparse, but the outcome is clear. Edmund secured the southern Danelaw, reducing Olaf's influence and gaining footholds deeper into contested land. Each victory increased his momentum. Each fortified town that submitted made the next easier. Edmund's slow, calculated expansion demonstrated his strategic maturity. He wasn't racing toward York recklessly. He was building a stable corridor through which his forces could travel, supply, and communicate reliably. This was how kings conquered sustainably. In 943, Olaf's situation became untenable. His power in Dublin crumbled. Rivals within the Viking world challenged him openly. When he attempted to maintain both Dublin and York, he failed to secure either. This dissolution gave Edmund the opportunity he had been preparing for. Olaf's attention fractured. His resources dwindled, and many of his followers began questioning whether he could keep control of York at all. As Olaf retreated to Ireland to salvage what remained of his influence there, Edmund moved decisively. This wasn't merely a military action. It was a strategic, almost surgical reclaiming of authority. Edmund filled the vacuum Olaf left with impressive speed, persuading local leaders to accept him as overlord. This moment marked the true turning of the tide. For the first time, Edmund had realistic control over the path to York. The long-awaited reconquest was finally within reach. Taking York, however, was no simple matter. Even with Olaf gone, the city retained its own leadership, its own pride, and its own political identity. Many northern nobles were skeptical of southern kings. Edmund knew that marching north aggressively could trigger unification against him. So he advanced with a careful combination of military presence and diplomatic reassurance. His forces encircled strategic routes, cutting off potential reinforcements. Envoys entered the region with messages promising fair terms to those who submitted peacefully. York was a city fortified both physically and culturally. Its walls were strong, but its identity was stronger. For Edmund, this wasn't merely a military conquest. It was a symbolic restoration of English unity. He moved slowly, deliberately, knowing that the real victory would come not from crushing the city, but from convincing it that English rule offered more stability than eternal conflict. The breakthrough came when Wulfstan, the Archbishop of York, made his allegiance clear. After months of negotiation, he formally recognized Edmund as the rightful king. This wasn't just a political shift, it was a spiritual endorsement. In medieval England, religious authority legitimized political rule. With Wulfstan's oath, Edmund's claim to the north gained divine weight. People who had remained neutral began reconsidering. Nobles previously supportive of Viking rule now saw that resistance was futile. Chroniclers describe this moment with reverence. Wulfstan's oath transformed the atmosphere across the region. Edmund responded not with arrogance but with gratitude. He confirmed protections for the church, maintained local customs, and demonstrated respect for northern identity. This combination of strength and respect was key. The north wasn't conquered, it was persuaded. Edmund's brilliance lay not only in his military strategy, but in his ability to win hearts as well as territory. In 944, Edmund entered York as its rightful king. It was a moment of extraordinary significance. The city that had slipped from English control multiple times was now pacified not by overwhelming force, but by diplomacy, patience, and strategic brilliance. The people of York didn't greet him with rebellion. They greeted him with cautious acceptance. And in that acceptance lay the foundation of a more united England. Edmund's entrance into York marked a completion of Athelstan's vision. The fragile unity of England had been restored. Yet Edmund didn't celebrate recklessly. He consolidated authority calmly, confirmed local leaders in their positions, and ensured that the transition caused minimal disruption. This wasn't a victory parade, it was a carefully choreographed reestablishment of trust. Edmund knew that unity won through intimidation alone would never last. Unity built through cooperation had a chance. Once York was secured, Edmund wasted no time. He understood that reconquest was only the first step. Maintaining control required infrastructure, alliances, and foresight. He reinforced key fortifications, ensuring that if future Viking raiders attempted to regain the city, they would face strong defenses. But he also preserved local governance structures, a move that fostered trust. He didn't impose southern systems on the north. He allowed the region's unique identity to coexist within a unified England. Edmund also encouraged interregional trade, connecting northern markets with those of Mercia and Wessex. By doing so, he transformed unity from a political concept into an economic reality. When people profit from peace, they defend it. And that was Edmund's brilliance. He didn't simply want to rule the North. He wanted the North to embrace the idea of being part of England. Through policies that prioritized stability over domination, Edmund ensured that his reconquest was not temporary but lasting. After securing York, Edmund took a decisive symbolic action that completed his victory. He expelled the last of Olaf's remaining supporters from English territory. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were loyalists, administrators, and influential figures who still saw the region's future tied to Viking leadership. Allowing them to remain would risk future rebellion. Removing them sent a clear message. The age of divided rule was over. Yet Edmund performed this expulsion with notable restraint. Chronicles suggest that many were given safe passage rather than execution. This approach reinforced Edmund's identity as a just king rather than a vengeful one. By neutralizing the remnants of Viking political presence without unnecessary cruelty, he strengthened his legitimacy and minimized resentment. This act, though less dramatic than battle, was a powerful closing chapter to the struggle for the North. By the mid-940s, Edmund had achieved what many thought impossible for a young king. He had restored unity to a fractured England, resecured York, established alliances with key church leaders, and demonstrated exceptional political maturity. Just in his early 20s, he stood at the height of his power. Chroniclers called him wise, magnificent, and formidable not because of poetic exaggeration, but because he had earned those titles through strategic intelligence rather than brute force. This period of Edmund's reign marks a turning point. Instead of playing defense, he could now pursue positive reforms, economic, administrative, and cultural. He could reward loyalty, strengthen institutions, and set England on a trajectory of peace. The unity he built would make possible the future achievements of later kings like Edgar the Peaceful, and even shape the conditions leading up to the Norman conquest a century later. But Edmund's story, powerful as it was far from over. With political stability achieved, Edmund began turning his attention toward governance. Medieval legal systems were a blend of custom, tradition, and emerging royal authority. Edmund strengthened the role of royal law, issuing decrees that clarified property disputes, standardized certain punishments, and enhanced protections for churches and widows. While the language of these laws may seem distant to modern ears, their purpose was clear: create order in a world that had been shaken by conflict. What made Edmund's legal approach impressive was its practicality. He didn't attempt to reinvent the system. Instead, he refined it, incorporating existing customs while tightening central authority. His laws contributed to England's development as one of the most legally unified regions of medieval Europe. In a time when many European kingdoms were fragmented into competing jurisdictions, Edmund pushed England toward coherence. His reforms didn't just maintain peace, they built the foundations for a more stable future. Edmund's partnership with the church deepened during this period. Kingship and Christianity were deeply intertwined in medieval England. The church provided legitimacy, literacy, and administration, and in return, kings offered protection, land, and influence. Edmund invested heavily in monastic communities, granting lands, freeing them from burdensome taxation, and supporting the construction and repair of religious sites. This patronage wasn't merely spiritual, it was also political. Monasteries were centers of learning and economic productivity. Supporting them helped unify cultural identity across the realm. Monks also wrote chronicles, the historical records through which future generations would interpret Edmund's reign. By forging strong relationships with monastic leaders, Edmund ensured that his legacy would be preserved through favorable narratives. More importantly, he helped foster an intellectual revival that would flourish under later kings. With internal stability restored, Edmund began looking outward. Unlike earlier kings who were consumed by Viking threats, Edmund had the bandwidth to engage diplomatically with continental leaders. He strengthened ties with rulers in France and the Holy Roman Empire, positioned England as a stabilizing force in northern Europe, and engaged in marriage diplomacy that secured long-term alliances. Edmund's foreign policy was forward-thinking. Rather than seeking expansion abroad, which would have risked destabilizing his young unity, he focused on creating a network of peaceful relationships. This gave England breathing room to rebuild, grow economically, and prepare for future challenges. Edmund's diplomatic actions helped integrate England into the broader European political landscape, making it a recognized and respected power once again. Edmund's reign represents a subtle but significant shift in the nature of English kingship. Earlier rulers were often defined by constant warfare and reactionary leadership. Edmund, by contrast, demonstrated proactive governance. He didn't simply extinguish fires, he prevented them. He combined military competence with diplomacy, lawmaking, and economic foresight. This holistic approach set a new precedent. The king was no longer just a warrior chief. He was an administrator, a diplomat, a peacemaker, and a cultural patron. Edmund's emphasis on stable governance influenced how later kings approached their roles. His reign became a bridge between the chaotic pre-unification period and the more structured, prosperous age that followed. Though often overshadowed by more dramatic figures, the groundwork Edmund laid was essential to England's long-term development. Just when stability seemed secure, new threats emerged. Viking raids never fully stopped, even after Olaf's departure. Smaller bands of raiders tested England's defenses, probing for weaknesses. Edmund had to strengthen coastal protections, reinforce watchpoints, and ensure rapid mobilization of local militias. These measures didn't make headlines in chronicles, but they were essential for maintaining everyday security. Additionally, political tensions simmered among some English nobles. Success breeds jealousy. Edmund's growing authority made certain regional leaders uneasy. Although none dared open rebellion, Edmund had to maintain constant vigilance. His next major challenge wouldn't come from the north, but from a source much closer to home. A conflict was brewing that would test Edmund's judgment, morality, and resolve, and would lead to one of the most dramatic decisions of his reign. One of the most influential figures emerging during Edmund's mid-reign was Dunstan, a monk who would later become one of England's most famous church leaders. At this time, Dunstan was young, intellectually gifted, and deeply spiritual. He impressed many with his devotion and organizational talents. Edmund, recognizing his potential, began incorporating Dunstan into important court functions. This relationship would have profound consequences for England. Dunstan represented a new generation of religious leaders committed to reform, education, and moral discipline. By supporting him, Edmund aligned himself with a movement that would reshape English culture. Their partnership wasn't merely political, it was ideological. Dunstan encouraged Edmund to think about kingship not just in terms of power, but in terms of moral responsibility. This mentorship would influence many of Edmund's later reforms. With stability at home and growing influence abroad, Edmund began imagining a broader future for England. He envisioned a kingdom not merely stitched together by military victories, but united by shared laws, prosperous trade, and cultural identity. His actions during this period reflect a ruler thinking beyond his lifetime. He invested in infrastructure, improved relations with Wales and Scotland, and established policies that supported agricultural production. Edmund also encouraged artistic expression. Poetry, illuminated manuscripts, and courtly culture flourished. The king understood that a unified realm needed not only political cohesion, but shared stories and symbols. He was shaping a national identity still in its infancy. This cultural dimension of Edmund's reign is often overlooked, but it is essential to understanding why England did not fragment again after his death. The unity he built was emotional and cultural, not merely territorial. During this period, a moment of profound dynastic importance occurred, the birth of Edmund's son Edgar. This child would one day become Edgar the Peaceful, one of the most successful and revered kings in English history. Though Edmund could not see the future, the arrival of a healthy son strengthened the legitimacy of his dynasty. It reassured nobles that succession would be stable, reducing the risk of factional disputes. Chronicles describe Edgar's birth as a joyous event celebrated across the realm. For Edmund, it was more than a personal blessing, it was a political triumph. His legacy, once uncertain during the chaos of his early reign, now had the prospect of continuity. Edgar would grow up in a more stable England thanks to the foundations Edmund laid. Fatherhood often has a transformative effect on leaders, and for Edmund, it deepened his commitment to building a secure future. One of Edmund's most impressive diplomatic achievements was his peaceful summit with Welsh leaders. The relationship between England and Wales had long been complicated, sometimes allies, sometimes adversaries. But Edmund sought harmony. He hosted several Welsh princes, engaging in negotiations that emphasized mutual respect. Instead of demanding submission, he proposed cooperation in trade, defense, and border management. This diplomatic warmth paid off. For the first time in decades, the Welsh border remained relatively peaceful. Trade increased. Cultural exchange grew. Edmund demonstrated that strength didn't always mean coercion. Sometimes it meant empathy, listening, and partnership. Chroniclers note that this era marked a rare period of Anglo-Welsh stability, a testament to Edmund's diplomatic acumen. He was not simply a conqueror, but a peacemaker capable of bridging divides that had long defined the British Isles. By the time Edmund secured Northumbria once more, he understood better than anyone that peace in the 10th century was not a gentle exhale. It was a thin layer of calm stretched over unresolved ambition, old loyalties, and fresh wounds. His advisors celebrated the victory, yet Edmund remained cautious. Northumbria had accepted English rule, but acceptance was not the same thing as trust. Many of its nobles had sworn oaths to Viking kings. Others simply valued autonomy more than allegiance. And even though Edmund had proven his military capability, he knew that a single unpopular decision could ignite unrest again. This was one of the traits that made Edmund distinctive among early medieval rulers. His skepticism, his refusal to assume that victory meant permanence. He insisted on holding councils in the north, listening to grievances directly, meeting with bishops, and rebuilding bridges with local lords. Instead of ruling through fear or force, he governed by presence and consistency. Chronicles hint that he spent more time traveling than any king since Alfred, ensuring that the regions recently reclaimed remained firmly within the English system. Though young, Edmund displayed an older man's realism. England had won peace but not stability, and stability was now his next battlefield. Diplomacy in Edmund's era wasn't shaped by treaties drafted on parchment and sealed with multiple witnesses. It was a living, breathing process, a constellation of personal relationships, symbolic gestures, and carefully choreographed meetings. What set Edmund apart was his willingness to treat diplomacy not as an alternative to war, but as another form of warfare, subtle, slow, and often more effective. He crafted alliances not for spectacle but for function. When approaching Northumbrian and Mercian leaders, he didn't demand unconditional obedience. Instead, he reaffirmed their rights, clarified boundaries, and offered guarantees that English kings before him rarely extended. His goal wasn't domination, it was integration, and he knew integration demanded patience. Edmund also strengthened ties with the church, recognizing its unique influence across all classes. Bishops were often the only figures who held authority across territories, making them vital partners in reinforcing unity. Rather than imposing a single, centralized command, Edmund used a hybrid approach, a web of loyalties and mutually beneficial agreements. It wasn't flashy. It didn't create legends, but it worked. And in a world defined by division, that was revolutionary. One of Edmund's least celebrated but most important contributions was his push toward consistent law across the kingdom. England had inherited a patchwork of legal traditions: West Saxon laws, Mercian customs, Danelaw principles. These systems didn't blend easily. A crime punishable harshly in one region might barely register in another. And so Edmund saw law not just as justice, but as identity. A unified kingdom needed a unified sense of right and wrong. He convened councils aimed not at rewriting everything, but at harmonizing key principles. Punishments for murder, robbery, land disputes, and oath-breaking were clarified. The goal wasn't to erase regional identities. It was to create predictability. Edmund understood that people accept authority more easily when rules remain consistent and rulers appear fair. His legal reforms also addressed corruption, particularly abuses by local reeves, who often exploited their power. Edmund's laws specifically targeted such officials, signaling that even royal appointees were not immune to accountability. This earned him respect from common people, who saw in him a king aware of grassroots suffering. Though the reforms weren't perfect, they laid foundational stones for a later, more expansive legal identity: English law. In the early medieval world, currency wasn't just money, it was authority. Coins bearing a king's face circulated like miniature proclamations of power. Edmund recognized this deeply. One of his most forward-thinking reforms focused on coinage. Counterfeit coins were common, metal purity varied, and inconsistent weights meant trade was often messy, distrustful, and slow. Edmund's solution: standardization. He oversaw the striking of new, uniform coins featuring his portrait and careful inscriptions. More importantly, he tightened control over mints, restricting who had the authority to create coinage. This was not merely economic, it was political. By centralizing minting, Edmund established a symbolic and practical reminder of his sovereignty. He also pushed for stable marketplaces, protected zones where trade could flourish peacefully. Market tolls became regulated. Violent disputes within market grounds carried harsher punishments, emphasizing that commerce was sacred, a backbone of national stability. These reforms might sound mundane compared to battles and alliances, but they strengthened England in ways swords never could. At the heart of Edmund's reign was a simple insight: a unified kingdom must not only fight together but trade together. Even as England strengthened internally, danger simmered at its northern border. Scotland, or more accurately, the Kingdom of Alba, had long maintained a complex relationship with England. Sometimes ally, sometimes rival, always watchful. With Northumbria restored to English control, Scottish leaders felt hemmed in, their influence in the region shrinking. And in the 940s, diplomatic friction soon turned into confrontation. Reports reached Edmund's court of raids along the northern frontier, of cross-border skirmishes, of Scottish nobles stirring unrest among Northumbrian factions. Though far smaller than Viking invasions, these disruptions threatened the delicate stability Edmund was working so hard to build. Rather than rushing into battle, Edmund initiated talks demanding explanations, proposing settlements but preparing for war simultaneously. This was his style, negotiation backed by readiness. A king who could fight but preferred a clean ledger over a dramatic victory. This period reveals Edmund's strategic maturity. He understood that Scotland wasn't a reckless enemy. It was a neighbor desperate to preserve influence, and that made the coming conflict inevitable. When diplomacy with Scotland stalled, Edmund pivoted toward military readiness. But unlike some rulers of his age, he didn't mobilize every available soldier immediately. He moved with surgical precision. The Northern Campaign was designed not to destroy the Scots, but to force compliance without destabilizing the region. Edmund understood that a chaotic Northumbria would be a breeding ground for rebellion, and so his strategy balanced force with restraint. He organized units from Wessex, Mercia, and East Anglia, but relied heavily on Northumbrian contingents. A clever political move that reinforced their loyalty while lowering Southern resentment. Every step of the campaign planning showed thoughtfulness. Supply lines, winter contingencies, agreements with local nobles, plans to avoid prolonged sieges. What stands out is his insistence on discipline. Chronicles suggest Edmund demanded strict conduct from his troops, forbidding unnecessary looting or destruction. His goal wasn't terror, it was control. The message was clear: England was powerful but not reckless. This moral dimension to Edmund's military leadership set him apart in a brutal era. When Edmund's army finally marched north in a calculated show of strength, the Scots responded not with open battle but with negotiation. Edmund had anticipated this. The sheer discipline and size of his forces demonstrated that England was no longer the fractured realm of previous decades. It was unified, organized, and under a ruler who valued outcomes over glory. Edmund met with Scottish envoys on neutral ground, a symbolic gesture that allowed both sides to maintain dignity. The discussions were firm but not hostile. Edmund demanded respect for English boundaries and an end to interference in Northumbrian politics. In return, he offered guarantees of peaceful coexistence. The agreement that followed was not a treaty in the modern sense, but a mutual understanding rooted in shared interest. This outcome highlights Edmund's ability to wage war without bloodshed. His goal was never conquest but clarity, and clarity was exactly what he obtained. For the first time in years, England's northern frontier was predictable. In the aftermath of political stabilization, Edmund turned his attention to spiritual cohesion, a crucial but often overlooked aspect of medieval governance. The church was the most powerful cross-regional institution in England, reaching peasants, nobles, and monarchs alike. Religious unity meant national unity, and Edmund understood this intimately. He forged strong ties with major bishops, especially Odo of Canterbury, whose influence spanned much of the south. Edmund supported monastic reforms, encouraged the rebuilding of decayed religious houses, and promoted clergy known for discipline and scholarship. His court became a hub not only of politics, but of theological discussion and manuscript production. For Edmund, supporting the church wasn't just piety, it was infrastructure. Monasteries provided literacy, preserved laws, trained administrators, and anchored communities. Strengthening them was like strengthening the nervous system of the kingdom. This investment also helped calm regions recently brought back into the fold. The presence of trusted clergy helped stabilize areas where loyalty was still uncertain. Though medieval kings are often defined by military and political achievements, understanding Edmund requires examining his personal life, the quieter moments behind the power. Sources, though sparse, portray him as unusually composed, reflective, even studious. He was not known for explosive temper or reckless whims. Instead, He carried a sense of self-discipline that his advisors respected deeply. Edmund married twice, forming alliances that reinforced his political position. His marriages weren't merely dynastic tools. They offered stability and companionship at a time when kings lived under constant pressure. Chronicles mention his generosity, his fairness in disputes, and his compassion toward the poor, traits recorded not to flatter but because they stood out. His personal habits echoed his political style: steady, measured, deliberate. He was a king who valued order in his private life just as much as in his public one. And perhaps this consistency explains why so many contemporaries praised him despite his short reign. Edmund was not a king of spectacle, he was a king of substance. Rebuilding a country is more than winning battles and issuing laws. It requires investment in physical spaces. Edmund recognized that the scars of war lingered in towns damaged by raids and neglect. So he directed resources toward repairing fortifications, restoring bridges, revitalizing trade routes, and strengthening river crossings, essential arteries for travel and commerce. These projects stimulated local economies and bolstered morale. A rebuilt town was a symbol of possibility. A repaired road meant better markets, faster communication, and safer movement. Edmund's interest in infrastructure shows his forward-thinking nature. He understood that stability relied on both hearts and logistics. Travelers began noting improved roads in regions once considered unsafe. Merchants resumed movement. Villages once vulnerable to raids enjoyed greater protection. The kingdom began to breathe easier. It wasn't grandeur Edmund sought, it was functionality. And in the 10th century, that was revolutionary. By the late 940s, Edmund had achieved something rare: a relatively peaceful, unified, and economically stable England. But history rarely allows equilibrium to last. Beneath the calm surface, new tensions were forming. Some came from ambitious nobles who disliked Edmund's standardizing reforms. Others emerged from displaced rivals seeking revenge. And some simply came from the inherent volatility of a kingdom still young. Chronicles begin hinting at local disputes growing louder, factions sharpening their grievances, and powerful figures preparing to test the king's resolve. Edmund sensed this shift. He increased his presence across the kingdom, attending assemblies personally, settling disputes firsthand, and reinforcing his authority through fairness rather than fear. But even with his discipline and foresight, he could not know that his greatest challenge was approaching. Not from a foreign army or rebellious noble, but from an unexpected moment that history would record as both tragic and defining. The final act of Edmund's story was about to begin. By the close of the 940s, Edmund's England had reached a delicate balance. It was not a golden age. That term rarely applies to the 10th century, but it was a period of genuine possibility. Trade was improving, borders were relatively stable, the church was reorganizing, and the everyday lives of ordinary people felt just a bit more predictable. Farmers sowed knowing their crops would likely be harvested. Merchants traveled with fewer fears of sudden violence. Even the nobility, often difficult to please, seemed momentarily aligned with Edmund's vision. But stability in the medieval world was never static. It was a candle in a drafty hall, bright, warm, flickering, and constantly vulnerable. Edmund understood this deeply. He continued fostering loyalty among regional lords. He held royal assemblies with regularity. He listened to disputes, issued rulings, reaffirmed boundaries, and refreshed oaths. The king saw it as maintenance work, the unglamorous labor of keeping a fragile nation functioning. What he could not foresee was that the greatest danger to his reign would not come from a kingdom or army. It would come instead from a single man, acting in a single moment, with consequences that would reverberate through centuries. Though Edmund had successfully held the nobles together, their cooperation masked underlying tensions. Some disliked the tighter legal consistency he championed. Others resented how he strengthened royal oversight of marketplaces, mints, and reeves. A few felt sidelined as Edmund elevated loyal administrators with humble backgrounds. Medieval politics was far more personal than ideological, and many aristocrats valued privilege over national stability. Edmund navigated these tensions with finesse, but he knew factionalism simmered beneath the surface. The nobles understood the king's discipline, his restrained but firm approach. Yet some questioned whether a young ruler could keep these forces in check indefinitely. Edmund, however, remained undeterred. He doubled down on fairness, not favoritism. He believed justice was the most powerful unifying force he could wield. This commitment would indirectly set the stage for the moment that ended his life. Because justice does not merely reward virtue, it confronts wrongdoing. And confronting wrongdoing, especially among the elite, was dangerous. Edmund refused to allow corruption or lawlessness to stand uncontested, not even within the very hall where he would one day meet his fate. Among the most dangerous figures circulating in Edmund's world was a man named Leofa, sometimes written as Leif in manuscripts. Leofa was an outlaw, banished from the kingdom for serious crimes involving violence and theft. In Edmund's England, outlawry meant more than exile. It meant being stripped of protections, declared outside the law, vulnerable to anyone who wished to kill or capture you. To return without permission was an act of defiance, even rebellion. But Leofa did return, quietly, unnoticed at first, slipping back into the southern regions, blending among travelers, lurking near feasts and festivals where the king's presence was expected. Chronicles disagree on his motive, vengeance, madness, desperation, but all agree on one point: he was not supposed to be anywhere near the king. Yet in a time before professional police forces, before photo records, before checkpoints, tracking one determined man was almost impossible. Leofa drifted closer and closer to royal gatherings, his intentions unknown. Edmund himself likely knew of the outlaw's reappearance but could not yet act. The stage was set for a confrontation no chronicler could have predicted. In late May of 946, Edmund traveled with his household to Pucklechurch, a royal estate in the southwest of England. Royal feasts were not indulgent banquets but vital political rituals. They reaffirmed loyalty, distributed gifts, settled disputes, and celebrated recent successes. This feast, by all accounts, began like any other. The hall filled with nobles, clergy, household guards, and servants preparing tables laden with bread, ale, roasted meats, and seasonal fruits. Edmund's mood was said to be unusually light that day. Perhaps he felt a rare moment of accomplishment. Perhaps he recognized the progress England had made under his watch. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed the presence of companions he trusted, men who had fought beside him, advised him, laughed with him. None could have known that among the crowd was a man who should not have been alive in England, let alone inside the king's feast. The outlaw Leofa had slipped into the hall, blending into the commotion. Guards did not recognize him. Servants ignored him. Fate or misfortune allowed him a seat dangerously close to the king himself. As the feast continued, Leofa made his move. The atmosphere was loud: laughter, conversation, the scraping of trenchers and clinking of cups. In that noise, he rose suddenly. Witnesses recorded the moment with a sense of frozen horror. The outlaw, recognizing the king mere paces from him, lunged forward in a burst of violence. Edmund reacted instinctively, not like a distant monarch but like a warrior who had survived campaigns since adolescence. He stood, pushing aside those around him, and seized the attacker. Chroniclers say Edmund grabbed Leofa with his own hands, driving him backward, wrestling him as shocked nobles scrambled to react. The king shouted for help, but the attack was so sudden, so chaotic that even seasoned warriors hesitated, unsure what was happening. For a moment Edmund had the upper hand, but Leofa, desperate and feral, lashed out wildly. Steel flashed, blood spilled, and before anyone could intervene, the king, England's young, steady, promising ruler, was fatally wounded. He collapsed onto the wooden floor, the hall erupting into panic. In the moments after Edmund fell, The hall descended into a mixture of rage, grief, and disbelief. His companions surged upon Leofa, killing him on the spot. Guards flooded the room. Servants fled or wept. Nobles knelt beside the dying king, attempting to stop the bleeding, shouting for physicians, calling upon saints and God in utter desperation. But the wound was too deep, the loss too sudden. Edmund was only 25 years old. Word spread instantly beyond the hall. Some chroniclers say people outside heard the screams before messengers even arrived. A king who had fought armies, restored territories, and healed divisions had fallen not on the battlefield, but in the middle of a peaceful feast, not by an enemy general, but by a single outlaw acting alone. The symbolism struck every witness. The fragility of kingship, the thin line between order and chaos, the cruel reality that even the finest ruler could be lost in an instant. The kingdom that had finally begun to stabilize was now headless, its future thrown into uncertainty again. The news of Edmund's death tore through England like a storm. Messengers rode at breakneck speed to major towns, monasteries, and estates. People gathered in marketplaces to hear the devastating announcement. The church rang bells in mourning. Warriors who had fought under Edmund lowered their weapons in solemn tribute. It was not just the death of a king, it was the loss of a stabilizing force. The political implications were immediate. Would rival factions seize the moment? Would old enemies test England's borders? Would internal cohesion collapse? These were real fears in a kingdom still young, still vulnerable, still learning how to survive transitions of power. But just as uncertainty began to spread, another figure stepped forward to steady the realm: Edmund's younger brother, Edred. Edred was not as celebrated as his brother. He lacked the same physical strength, the same battlefield victories, but he possessed determination, piety, and a keen sense of duty. The moment Edmund's death was confirmed, Edred's accession became the kingdom's lifeline. Edred's coronation came swiftly, driven not by ceremony but necessity. The realm could not afford a power vacuum. Nobles gathered, bishops assembled, and the crown passed from brother to brother in one of the most somber transitions in English history. Edred accepted the crown not with triumph but with grief etched across his face. Unlike Edmund, Edred suffered chronic health issues. Chroniclers describe him as frail, often unable to eat solid food, his strength frequently failing him. Yet he inherited a kingdom that required resilience. He leaned heavily on trusted advisors, many of whom had served Edmund. They carried the institutional memory of the previous reign, a crucial advantage at a delicate moment. Edred's stability depended on continuing Edmund's policies, upholding the legal reforms, maintaining coinage consistency, reinforcing alliances with Northumbrian lords, and deterring Scottish interference. Though Edred would rule for 9 years, his achievements were inseparable from the groundwork Edmund had laid. The continuity preserved England's unity. In the weeks following Edmund's burial at Glastonbury, chronicles and clergy began reflecting on his reign with growing recognition. Though brief, only 6 years, his contributions were undeniable. He restored lost territories, reinforced political unity, and strengthened legal and economic systems that would influence England for generations. His reforms made Edred's rule possible. Without Edmund's stability, the kingdom might have fractured once again. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Edmund's legacy is how much he accomplished before the age of 26. Many kings twice his age achieved far less. He embodied responsibility from his teenage years, carried burdens of statecraft with composure, and governed with a maturity that belied his youth. Chroniclers began calling him Edmund the Magnificent, not because of extravagant conquests or monumental constructions, but because he had guided England through a crucial moment with steadiness, wisdom, discipline, and courage. Magnificence, they believed, was not in spectacle, it was in quiet strength. Edmund's reign became a blueprint for future kings. His insistence on consistent law foreshadowed the legal traditions that would define England for centuries. His reforms in coinage influenced the stability of medieval economy long after his death. His diplomatic strategies reduced warfare, expanded alliances, and set precedents for peaceful negotiation. The idea that an English king should prioritize fairness, even when inconvenient, traces its roots to Edmund. The balance he struck between firmness and restraint would be studied by successors like Edgar the Peaceful and even later kings who sought models of level-headed rule. In many ways, Edmund created the template for a stable, administrative monarchy rather than a purely war-driven one. His emphasis on infrastructure, church partnership, and regional integration helped shift England toward a more unified national identity. Without Edmund's middle-ground governance, England's later cultural and political development might have been far more fractured. When modern audiences imagine medieval kings, they often picture hardened warriors, distant rulers, or legendary figures larger than life. But Edmund's story invites a softer understanding, one of youth, vulnerability, and the emotional fragility behind the crown. Edmund never lived long enough to see old age, to watch his sons grow, or to witness the full flowering of the nation he helped stabilize. His life was a burst of potential abruptly cut short. There is a human sadness at the center of Edmund's narrative, a young man doing everything right yet unable to escape the unpredictability of his era. His death reminds us that medieval leadership was never secure, no matter how competent the ruler. It highlights the precariousness of life in a world without modern protection, security, or medical care. This emotional dimension helped cement Edmund's place in memory. People mourn not just a king but a life interrupted. A ruler who lived with discipline, ruled with fairness, fought when needed, and died defending his own table. Despite his short life, Edmund left behind an important lineage. His two sons, Edwig and Edgar, were children at the time of his death. Their youth made it impossible for them to succeed immediately, but their existence ensured the continuity of the House of Wessex. Under the guidance of Edred and later powerful advisors, the boys grew up in a kingdom stabilized enough to allow their development. Edgar, the younger son, would eventually become Edgar the Peaceful, one of the most celebrated rulers of the era, and his peaceful reign was only possible because Edmund had done the hard work of pulling England back from fragmentation. Through his children, Edmund's legacy extended into the golden period of late 10th century reform and stability. The emotional weight of growing up without their father likely shaped both boys. Chroniclers note Edgar's deep reverence for monastic reform and structured governance, values Edmund himself had championed. Chroniclers across England recorded Edmund's death with unusual emotion. Some described it as a tragic blow to the realm. Others focused on the injustice of a king cut down by an outlaw's blade rather than a worthy foe. Monastic writers emphasized the moral lesson. Even good kings can fall suddenly, reminding readers of life's impermanence. Poems and laments circulated in monastic communities, reflecting genuine sorrow. Edmund was remembered as a just ruler whose humility and discipline set him apart. His death also became a narrative tool, an example of the unpredictable nature of earthly life, urging people toward spiritual vigilance. For the nobility, Edmund's passing was a reminder that their own power depended on the stability of the crown. For common people, it meant uncertainty. For the church, it meant the loss of a partner deeply invested in reform. Few early English kings inspired such multifaceted grief. The months following Edmund's death were marked by wary calm. Edred's authority was recognized, yet uneasiness lingered. People remembered how quickly territory had been lost after Athelstan's death and feared history might repeat itself. But Edred, guided by Edmund's advisors, moved swiftly to reassure the realm. Assemblies reaffirmed loyalty, bishops preached unity, markets kept running, soldiers guarded borders, the machinery of the state continued. Yet beneath the surface, an emotional shadow hung over the kingdom, the feeling that a bright future had been dimmed. But that tension also spurred a new determination. England had lost a brilliant king, but it would not lose the progress he had made. That collective resolve became the quiet, unsung triumph of Edmund's reign. Edmund's burial place, the ancient and sacred site of Glastonbury, added another layer of significance to his legacy. Glastonbury Abbey was a spiritual heart of the kingdom, associated with legendary antiquity and revered by kings. Edmund's body was interred with solemn ceremony, accompanied by clergy, nobles, and grieving subjects. Choosing Glastonbury was a statement. It linked Edmund not just to his predecessors, but to the sacred continuity of English kingship. The abbey became a place where people prayed for his soul, sought his memory, and reflected on his contributions. Over time, his tomb became an anchor for the monastic community, inspiring future reforms under his son Edgar. Edmund was remembered not as a conqueror but as a builder, something reflected in the choice of his burial ground. History relies on the survival of evidence, and Edmund's reign is a mosaic assembled from chronicles, charters, legal codes, coin finds, and monastic writings. Each fragment offers hints of a king who governed with remarkable steadiness. Yet the gaps invite questions. How did Edmund make decisions behind closed doors? What private fears or ambitions shaped his actions? What might he have accomplished with another decade of life? Part of Edmund's mystique comes from these missing pieces. He stands between the grand legacies of Alfred, Athelstan, and Edgar, a transitional figure whose quiet brilliance often goes overlooked. But when historians examine what changed during those 6 years, they see the unmistakable fingerprints of a leader determined to build something lasting. The puzzle of Edmund's reign invites not just analysis, but imagination, a rare gift from an era so often shrouded in silence. Modern historians reevaluate Edmund through a lens unavailable to medieval chroniclers: long-term impact. And through that lens, Edmund shines brighter than many better-known kings. Scholars emphasize his legal reforms, his steady diplomacy, and his skill in reclaiming and integrating Northumbria. His reign marks the moment England shifted from constant crisis management to genuine structural development. They also point out his modern-like leadership style: pragmatic, strategic, patient, and administrative rather than flamboyant. That subtle, competent governance often escapes popular attention, but historians recognize it as the backbone of stable nations. Many scholars now argue that Edmund deserves far greater recognition. Without his steady hand, England may have faltered in the mid-10th century, delaying or even derailing the formation of a unified English identity. When Edmund is compared to kings like Alfred the Great or William the Conqueror, he may seem overshadowed. They fought monumental wars, introduced sweeping reforms, or reshaped the kingdom through iconic events. Edmund operated differently, quietly, precisely, and with long-term focus. But such rulers are essential to the survival of nations. Alfred saved England. Athelstan unified it. But Edmund stabilized it, and without stability, unity collapses. He was not a conqueror but a steward, not a legend but a foundation. And foundations, though often invisible, hold everything else in place. His successors benefited immensely from the groundwork he laid, proving that greatness is not always measured in dramatic victories. Sometimes it is measured in the absence of collapse. At the heart of Edmund's story lies a powerful emotional truth. Leadership is often defined not by moments of glory, but by the weight of responsibility. Edmund carried that weight with grace. He could have been a king who sought easy victories or personal glory. Instead, he chose the harder path, the path of steady reform, quiet oversight, and long-term vision. His death underscores the fragility of that work, but it does not diminish it. In fact, the tragedy intensifies appreciation for what he achieved. He lived in an era of danger, yet created safety. He inherited a divided land, yet fostered unity. He faced unpredictable threats, yet responded with discipline and wisdom. His story invites reflection on how much can be accomplished in a short life, and how leadership at its best is a service, not a spectacle. In the long arc of English history, Edmund stands as a bridge, the connection between foundational kings and the flourishing of an organized medieval state. His work allowed successors to centralize authority, reform monastic life, and expand cultural influence. Edmund's England was not yet the powerful realm it would become, but it was positioned correctly because he positioned it. He is a reminder that history is not shaped only by extraordinary events. It is shaped by patient architecture, the careful placement of laws, alliances, reforms, and norms that become the bones of a nation. Edmund's reign invites us to appreciate subtle power, the quiet type, the kind that strengthens foundations, secures borders, protects people, and prepares the ground for future greatness. In a world obsessed with spectacle, Edmund offers the lessons of calm leadership. And so, as we close the story of Edmund the Magnificent, we return to the beginning, a young king in a fragile kingdom, stepping into responsibility with wisdom beyond his years. His life demonstrates that even in eras of violence and uncertainty, leadership grounded in fairness and discipline can reshape a nation. He reminds us that quiet achievements matter, that stability is a form of heroism, and that legacies built on integrity last far longer than those built on conquest. Edmund's reign ended violently, but his impact endured peacefully. His work paved the way for the English peace under his son Edgar, and for the later cultural flourishing that shaped the medieval identity of England. Forgotten by many, yet essential to the story of a nation, Edmund invites us to look closer, to see the power in subtlety, the importance of resilience, and the beauty of a life lived in service. His name may not ring loudly in the halls of popular history, but in the deeper currents of the past, Edmund the Magnificent stands firm, a steady flame in a turbulent age. When a king dies suddenly, it is not just a tragedy, it is a political earthquake. Edmund's death triggered tremors that rippled across noble families, alliances, and landholders throughout England. In the 10th century, nobles held enormous power. They controlled armies, oversaw courts, and shaped local economies. Many owed their positions directly to Edmund's trust. Now, with his death, the question was simple and terrifying. Would their loyalties hold? Some nobles were genuinely grief-stricken. They had fought beside Edmund, shared meals with him, received his counsel. Others, however, saw opportunity. The death of a ruler often meant shifting influence, renegotiating boundaries, or reclaiming old privileges. Edred, Edmund's brother and successor, understood that managing the nobility would make or break his reign. He reaffirmed titles, renewed oaths, and ensured the most powerful earldoms remained stable. But there was an undercurrent of tension. Who would guide young Edgar and Edwig? Which families would rise? Which would fall? The landscape of English politics had changed overnight, and every nobleman in the realm felt the uncertainty. In a world without newspapers, without public announcements, without formal channels of communication, rumors spread faster than truth. Edmund's death became the subject of whispered speculation in town squares, monasteries, markets, and taverns. Some believed Leofa had acted alone. Others suspected he had been hired. A few even imagined foreign interference, a Scottish plot, a Viking scheme, or a Northumbrian conspiracy. Most of these theories were unfounded, but fear thrives in confusion. Without clarity, uncertainty fills the void. Medieval people often interpreted sudden events through spiritual or symbolic lenses. Some wondered if Edmund's death was divine punishment. Others believed it was a warning, urging England toward greater unity or repentance. The imagination of the era was powerful. Many believed in omens, portents, and cosmic signs. Chroniclers recorded unusual weather, strange comets, or thunder on the night of his death. Whether these events actually occurred or not was irrelevant. What mattered was the emotional truth. People were searching for meaning in a senseless tragedy. In uncertain times, the church often became the stabilizing force of the kingdom. Bishops and abbots acted not only as spiritual leaders but as administrators, diplomats, and counselors. After Edmund's death, church leaders moved quickly to calm the population. They preached unity, encouraged obedience to the new king Edred, and framed Edmund's death within a spiritual narrative, not as chaos, but as divine mystery. For many ordinary people, this was deeply reassuring. The church offered rituals, prayers, and structured mourning ceremonies that helped communities process their grief. Monasteries rang bells through the night, held vigils, and copied prayers into manuscripts dedicated to the fallen king. The church also guided political continuity. Senior bishops advised Edred on which nobles to trust, how to secure Northumbria, and how to preserve Edmund's legal reforms. Their influence was immense, and they recognized the importance of keeping the realm unified under a single crown. History often focuses on the powerful, but the emotional weight of Edmund's death was felt just as deeply among ordinary villagers, farmers, artisans, and traders. To many, Edmund had represented fairness, a king who protected markets, upheld justice, and kept the peace. His reforms touched everyday life in ways the poor rarely experienced under medieval rulers. Common people mourned him in their own ways. Some lit candles at small wooden shrines. Others paused work to pray in the fields. Traders in bustling markets lowered their voices and discussed the future with worry. Mothers comforted children who sensed the shift in atmosphere. Elders whispered stories of earlier kings and the chaos that followed their deaths. For many, Edmund's passing was not just a national tragedy, it was a personal fear. Stability was rare in the 10th century. One bad harvest, one raid, one political crisis could change lives overnight. Edmund had given them a sense of safety, and his death reopened old anxieties. Edred's first task as king was to secure acceptance across the entire realm. Southern England was firmly behind him, but Northumbria had always been unpredictable, prone to rebellion, shifting loyalties, and political fragmentation. Edmund had spent years holding the North together through careful diplomacy. Now Edred had to prove he was strong enough to continue that work. He immediately summoned northern leaders to renew their allegiance. He reinstated loyal governors, restored disputed lands, and ensured that powerful earls felt recognized. His ruling council advised him to present continuity, not change. Where Edmund was physically strong, Edred relied on authority through the church and trusted nobles. These swift decisions prevented a potential rebellion. Even Viking-settled areas, which had resisted English rule decades earlier, accepted Edred's kingship, largely because Edmund had laid a foundation of predictable governance. With Edmund gone, several key positions in the royal household needed urgent replacement. The king's personal advisors, lawkeepers, and estate managers were essential to the function of the realm. Their roles involved everything from tax collection to managing food supplies for the court. Edred quickly filled vacancies with trusted personnel who had worked closely with Edmund. This continuity created stability not just politically but economically. But not everyone was satisfied. A few nobles hoped Edmund's death would provide opportunities for power grabs. Some attempted to influence appointments. Others sought to gain control of key estates or regional offices. Edred and his advisors carefully navigated these ambitions, rewarding loyalty and curbing overreach. This delicate balancing act prevented political fragmentation, the exact outcome Edmund would have hoped for. One of Edred's most significant decisions was to keep Edmund's legal reforms in place. Rather than rewriting codes or adjusting taxes, he preserved the structure Edmund had established. This was a strategic move. The consistency reassured landowners, merchants, and farmers who feared sudden changes. Edmund's legal system emphasized fair compensation, regulated trade practices, and standardized penalties. These laws were not arbitrary. They reflected a shift toward a society where predictable rules replaced personal vengeance or local customs. In a time when legal chaos could spark feuds, Edmund's policies were revolutionary. Edred recognized this and understood something crucial. Stability is not achieved through constant reinvention but through predictable governance. By upholding Edmund's laws, he honored the legacy of his brother and protected the realm from disruption. Although Edmund ruled as a measured and stabilizing monarch, he never forgot his warrior roots. Chroniclers recalled how he fought as a teenager beside his brother Athelstan at Brunanburh, one of the most important battles in English history. Even in peace, he trained, drilled, and led men with authority. His ability to confront danger directly, as he did during the fatal attack at Pucklechurch, reflected a life lived on the threshold between duty and risk. After his death, soldiers across the kingdom honored him. Veterans shared stories of his leadership in combat. Young men looked up to him as a model of disciplined strength. His image became part of England's martial memory, a king who defended the kingdom not only with laws but with his own hands. In many ways, Edmund embodied the transition between the warrior kings of early England and the administrative kings of the later medieval era. A medieval kingdom did not run on loyalty alone, it required money. Edmund had improved the treasury through consistent taxation, revived trade routes, and more uniform coinage. This economic foundation allowed Edred to step in without facing a financial crisis. Coinage was especially important. By standardizing the weight and purity of silver pennies, Edmund ensured that merchants trusted the currency. Before this reform, inconsistent coins had damaged trade and undermined savings. Under Edmund, English pennies became widely respected in Northern Europe. Edred continued minting coins with the same standards, preserving economic confidence. Traders from Scandinavia, Francia, and Ireland continued to conduct business in English markets. This stability prevented shortages, maintained food supplies, and kept the kingdom functioning smoothly despite the political upheaval. Though England was not yet the powerhouse it would later become, Edmund's steady policies earned respect abroad. Foreign courts in Scotland, the Welsh kingdoms, and the Norse settlements recognized his ability to maintain order and negotiate fairly. Edmund restored English influence in Northumbria, which had long been a battleground between competing cultures. Foreign chroniclers, though often brief, noted his leadership. They saw a king capable of balancing firmness with diplomacy, a rare quality in an era marked by warfare. Some Viking leaders even entered into peaceful agreements with him, acknowledging his authority as a stabilizing force in the region. After his death, envoys from neighboring territories expressed both condolences and political curiosity. Would England remain strong under Edred, or would fragmentation return? The world was watching. One of Edmund's subtle achievements was recognizing the value of a connected kingdom. Early medieval England was still a patchwork of regions with local customs, dialects, and power structures. Edmund encouraged smoother communication between them, not through modern infrastructure, but through consistent laws, trade routes, and judicial oversight. He supported rebuilding bridges, maintained safer roads, and established clearer boundaries to reduce disputes. These small changes helped turn England from a collection of loosely linked territories into a more unified state. Merchants traveled more safely, messages reached distant towns faster, and local leaders understood the king's expectations. This groundwork laid the basis for the administrative reforms that flourished under Edgar, Edmund's younger son. Edmund's reign saw cultural developments that are often overlooked. Literacy began to rise among clergy. Monastic scriptoria produced more manuscripts. Artistic styles, influenced by both Celtic and continental traditions, evolved into distinct forms. Cross-cultural interactions enriched England's material culture, from metalwork to decorated textiles. These shifts were not earthquakes but gentle tides, yet they contributed to a sense of growing identity. People began seeing themselves not just as West Saxons, Mercians, or Northumbrians, but as part of a broader English world. Edmund supported monasteries and learning centers, ensuring resources flowed to institutions that shaped culture for centuries. The 10th century may appear distant and dim in the historical imagination, but it was a period of profound creativity, and Edmund's stability allowed that creativity to flourish. The presence and influence of women in Edmund's reign is an often overlooked aspect of his story. His mother, Queen Egifu, was one of the most influential royal women of the 10th century. Wise, politically skillful, and deeply respected by the church, she advised both of her sons, Edmund and Edred, and played a key role in mediating disputes. Edmund's queen, Aelfgifu, also carried influence. She was closely connected to powerful noble families and played a role in strengthening alliances. Through marriage diplomacy, estate management, and patronage of religious houses, she contributed to the stability Edmund built. In a world where royal marriages created political ripples, Aelfgifu's network of alliances helped the crown maintain connections across regions. Her survival after Edmund's death ensured continuity for his sons. After Edmund's death, his sons Eadwig and Edgar were placed under careful guardianship. Their upbringing became a matter of national concern. The realm needed future kings who understood governance, spirituality, diplomacy, and law. Monks and scholars took responsibility for their education, teaching them Latin, scripture, legal traditions, and the skills necessary for leadership. Edgar, the younger son, showed particular discipline. Chroniclers later described him as calm, thoughtful, and deeply influenced by monastic values, traits likely shaped during these formative years. Eadwig, meanwhile, struggled under the strict routines. His later reign would reflect the tension between his personal desires and his kingly duties. This period of education highlights the long-term effects of Edmund's legacy. The values he cherished, discipline, fairness, unity, were passed on through the careful molding of his heirs. Unity in a medieval kingdom was not a natural state, it was a constant effort. Edred inherited Edmund's challenge of keeping fractious regions aligned under a single crown. Northumbria continued to test boundaries. Mercia sought autonomy. Wessex guarded its traditional dominance. Edmund had held these tensions together with personal authority and disciplined leadership. Edred relied instead on coalitions. He formed alliances with the church, key earls, and influential families. Although less physically imposing than Edmund, his political instincts served him well. But this unity was always fragile. The memory of Edmund's strong hand shaped the expectations of the realm, and many wondered if anyone could truly replace him. Yet the kingdom did not collapse, a testament to the strength of the system Edmund built. Symbolism mattered deeply in the medieval mind. A king dying during a feast, a place of peace, unity, and celebration, shocked the imagination. Feasts represented order and hierarchy. The king at the head of the table symbolized harmony in the kingdom. To see that order shattered so abruptly felt like a cosmic message. Chroniclers interpreted the event as a reminder that earthly life is fleeting, that kings are mortal, and that chaos lurks beneath even the most peaceful scenes. In some texts, Edmund's death is framed almost as a martyrdom, a king dying to protect his people from violence within the sacred space of hospitality. This sense of symbolic rupture intensified the emotional response of the era and ensured that Edmund's death would be remembered for generations. Different chronicles recorded Edmund's death with varying details, but all agreed on its basic tragedy. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle is brief but somber, noting the king's sudden fall. Later writers like John of Worcester and William of Malmesbury added narrative depth, describing the circumstances with drama and moral reflection. Each chronicler wrote with purpose. Some emphasized Edmund's bravery in confronting his attacker. Others highlighted the unpredictability of fate. Monks added spiritual commentary, framing the event as a demonstration of divine mystery. These overlapping accounts give us a multi-layered understanding of his final moments. Although details differ, did he fall instantly? Did he speak before dying? The core of the story remains powerful. A young king struck down at the height of his promise. The emotional shock within Edmund's court cannot be overstated. For his personal companions, men who had guarded him, traveled with him, shared long nights of planning and long days of work, the loss was devastating. Many had known Edmund since adolescence. They watched him grow from a promising prince into a respected king. Trauma rippled through the royal household. Pages who had admired him, guards who had trained under him, and clerks who had witnessed his discipline were left grieving. Some recorded prayers in margins of manuscripts. Others donated personal wealth to monasteries in his memory. The sense of vulnerability was profound. If a king could be killed in a hall full of nobles, what protection did anyone have against sudden violence? That question haunted the court for months. Edmund's death forced immediate legal action. Leofa, the outlaw responsible, had been killed on the spot, but his crime had broader legal implications. Outlawry was reaffirmed as one of the most severe penalties in Anglo-Saxon law. Anyone who aided Leofa, knowingly or unknowingly, faced harsh consequences. Courts investigated whether Leofa had accomplices. Records suggest no conspiracy was found, though some nobles remained suspicious. Edred used the moment to reinforce legal authority. He increased patrols, tightened court oversight, and reevaluated how security was handled at major gatherings. This tragedy became a turning point for medieval event safety. Subsequent feasts saw more guards, stricter entry controls, and clearer responsibilities. The hall was no longer just a place of celebration. It had become a symbol of vulnerability. Monastic reform flourished in the decades after Edmund's death, particularly under his son Edgar. Yet the groundwork began with Edmund himself. He supported monasteries at Glastonbury, Abingdon, and Winchester, centers that would later drive a cultural and spiritual transformation. His reign encouraged discipline, literacy, and moral leadership. These values aligned perfectly with the goals of reformers like Dunstan, Ethelwold, and Oswald, who later reshaped English monastic life. Without Edmund's earlier support, these reforms might have struggled for political stability or financial backing. Thus, Edmund's influence extended far beyond his lifetime. His disciplined character helped shape a generation of leaders who carried spiritual renewal across England. As centuries passed, Edmund's memory shifted. Medieval historians of the 11th and 12th centuries saw him as a model of restrained kingship, a man who ruled competently without seeking personal glory. Later chroniclers emphasized his fairness, framing him as a righteous ruler in an era often defined by chaos. By the time of the Norman conquest, Edmund's legacy had been absorbed into the mythic lineage of English kings. Even Norman writers, often skeptical of Anglo-Saxon rulers, acknowledged his steadiness. In monastic traditions, he was remembered with quiet reverence, a king whose life demonstrated the fragility of human plans and the dignity of disciplined governance. Although he never became a legendary hero like Alfred, he remained respected, a steady figure in the river of English memory. Despite his significant impact, Edmund is far less famous today than other early English kings. Part of this is timing. His reign was short, his death sudden, and his achievements subtle rather than spectacular. He did not win legendary battles, build iconic structures, or launch sweeping campaigns, but history rewards drama. Monumental events overshadow foundational ones. Edmund's legacy is quieter: legal reforms, territorial stability, fair governance, improved trade, and disciplined leadership. These contributions are essential, but they lack the dramatic flair that captures the popular imagination. Today, historians recognize that Edmund's relative obscurity is undeserved. His reign formed the backbone of mid-10th century stability, positioning England for cultural and political growth. Edmund's life offers powerful lessons for leadership in any era. He demonstrates that stability is not accidental. It is built through consistent decisions, fair laws, and thoughtful diplomacy. He shows that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks in quiet discipline. And most importantly, his story highlights the fragility of peace. A single moment can undo years of careful work. His death underscores that leadership requires both courage and humility. His reign shows that lasting impact often comes from building structures others can maintain. And his legacy teaches us that even a short life can transform a nation when guided by principle and duty. Church, the site of Edmund's death, remains a point of historical reflection. Though the original royal hall is long gone, the village bears markers and memorials that commemorate the event. Visitors often describe a quiet, contemplative atmosphere, a place where history feels close, even if the physical structures have vanished. Archaeologists have traced the likely footprint of the hall, piecing together the spatial layout from soil patterns and local records. The simplicity of the site stands in contrast to the magnitude of the event that occurred there. No towering monuments, no elaborate ruins, just a quiet village shaped by an echo from the past. Standing in Church today, one can almost imagine the feast, the torches, the sudden cry, the king rising to defend himself. The silence of the present invites the imagination to fill in what time has erased. Unlike later monarchs, Edmund left behind no portraits, sculptures, or detailed physical descriptions. Historians reconstruct his appearance through indirect evidence, descriptions of his character, depictions of his family, and the artistic conventions of the time. Coins minted during his reign show a stylized profile, emphasizing authority rather than realism. Manuscripts depict him in symbolic form, a young king, clean-shaven, holding a cross or sword. These images are artistic interpretations, not likenesses, yet the absence of a portrait adds to his mystique. Edmund becomes a figure shaped by ideas rather than features, a symbol of stability rather than a face in a gallery. In this way, his image evolves across generations, adapting to the values of each era. Edmund's reign played a quiet but crucial role in shaping early English identity. The unification of territories under his rule helped people begin to see themselves not only as members of regional groups, but as part of a larger kingdom. His laws standardized behavior across regions. His diplomacy reduced internal conflict. His administration encouraged a shared understanding of justice, currency, and royal authority. These elements contributed to the emergence of a more coherent political and cultural identity. Later monarchs like Edgar and Ethelred built upon this foundation, and even the Normans would inherit a kingdom shaped by the early efforts of kings like Edmund. In this sense, Edmund was a nation builder, not through conquest, but through consistency. It may seem strange to compare a 10th century king to modern leadership standards, yet Edmund's qualities resonate strongly today. His emphasis on fairness, consistency, conflict resolution, and long-term planning mirrors contemporary ideals of responsible governance. He understood the importance of law, the danger of corruption, and the value of predictable administration. Modern readers often imagine medieval kings as impulsive warriors or authoritarian figures, but Edmund defies those stereotypes. He blended firmness with restraint, discipline with compassion, and ambition with caution. These traits align with what many today consider hallmarks of effective leadership. His reign reminds us that good governance transcends time, rooted not in force, but in integrity. The story of Edmund the Magnificent illustrates how easily a figure can fade from mainstream history. A short reign, a tragic death, and a lack of dramatic events can overshadow even significant contributions. Yet the survival of his memory, however quiet, speaks to the importance of chroniclers, manuscripts, and the historians who revisit overlooked figures. History is not just a list of famous names. It is a tapestry woven from countless lives, decisions, and moments. Edmund's story would have vanished if not for the scribes who recorded it, the monks who preserved it, and the modern scholars who re-examined it. His legacy reminds us that remembering matters, because every piece of history offers insight into the present. As we near the end of this chapter of Edmund's life, his core values stand out clearly: discipline, fairness, unity, and responsibility. These were not merely abstract principles, they were lived daily through his actions. He reformed laws to protect ordinary people. He managed nobles with firmness and respect. He reclaimed territory without needless brutality. He supported the church as a partner in governance. These values shaped the political culture of mid-10th century England. They became part of what later kings inherited and defended. Even centuries later, chroniclers praised Edmund not for being extraordinary, but for being steadfast, a quality often more valuable than greatness. And so, as we close this chapter of Edmund the Magnificent, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of history and memory. His life, though brief, resonates across centuries because it shows the strength of quiet leadership. He reminds us that true power lies not in spectacle but in service, not in the size of one's reign, but in the depth of one's impact. The echoes of Edmund's decisions continued long after he was laid to rest. His reforms shaped the kingdom his sons would rule. His stability allowed culture and faith to flourish. His death, tragic and sudden, forced England to confront the fragility of peace and inspired leaders to protect it more fiercely. Edmund's story is not one of grand monuments, glorious victories, or legendary myths. It is the story of a young ruler who chose responsibility over ambition, justice over convenience, and unity over division. In the end, that is why he remains magnificent. When Edmund died, the shock did not stop at the hall where the struggle took place. It radiated outward, first through Winchester, then across Wessex, and eventually through every shire, monastery, and settlement. The news traveled on horseback, whispered in markets, spoken in disbelief in taverns, and chanted somberly in church services. A king had died, not in battle, not on campaign, but in a single chaotic moment during a feast. And because his reign was still young, the realm was not yet ready to speak of him as a distant memory. England had been stable under Edmund, but it was a stability still in its infancy. The idea of a unified kingdom, the belief that the English were one people, remained tender and vulnerable. Edmund had held the fracturing pieces together through discipline, presence, and a rare sense of responsibility. And suddenly, that force was gone. Chroniclers hint at fear, a quiet, almost superstitious dread that the country might unravel. But something remarkable happened instead. The system Edmund strengthened did not collapse. His death was a tragedy, but it was also a test, one England passed. After Edmund's death, the throne passed to his younger brother, Edred, a man quieter, more reserved, and physically frailer than Edmund. Yet this transition revealed the strength of what Edmund had built. No civil war erupted. No rival claimant seized the moment. No Viking chieftain launched a sudden invasion. Instead, Witan and clergy rallied behind Edred with almost surprising unity. Why? Because the country Edmund shaped was no longer held together by a single personality. His laws, his councils, his reforms, his diplomacy, all of them created a framework that continued to function even after its architect was gone. Edred inherited not chaos, but a structure. And while he governed differently, with more reliance on church leaders, more caution, and less personal presence, he benefited directly from the environment his brother left behind. If Edmund had ruled like a tyrant or focused only on conquest, the succession might have fractured. Instead, his administrative discipline made England unusually prepared for continuity. It is easy to overlook this, but the survival of a kingdom after a sudden royal death is one of the truest signs of a strong ruler. Edmund's legacy becomes clearer when we step back from individual events and look at the larger pattern. Medieval history is often told through stories of dramatic kings, warriors, visionaries, tyrants, martyrs. But the true foundation of nations is not built by spectacle. It's built by systems, consistency, rules, predictability. Edmund represented the shift from a kingdom ruled by personalities to a kingdom supported by institutions. He strengthened royal authority, but made it less dependent on charisma. He unified law without erasing regional identity. He stabilized coinage, markets, and communication. He ensured that the church and the crown worked together rather than at odds. He demanded discipline within the army, not just bravery. These changes seem simple, almost administrative. But in a world filled with sudden invasions, unpredictable leaders, and fragile alliances, these reforms were revolutionary. Edmund's reign shows us that sometimes the most transformative rulers are not the loudest, but the most deliberate. This is the irony of Edmund's story. His greatness lies in how effortlessly England continued after him. Edmund reigned between two major dynastic figures, his half-brother Athelstan, the first king of a unified England, and his son Edgar, the architect of one of the most stable periods in English history. This positioning makes Edmund easy to overlook, but it also shows his importance. He was the bridge, the keystone, the stabilizer between two eras of expansion and consolidation. Without him, the line from early unity to later prosperity would not feel smooth or inevitable. It would be broken, jagged, interrupted by disunity. Edmund protected what Athelstan created. Edmund prepared the ground for Edgar's reforms. He was the quiet fulcrum between giants. And what's more, Edmund set precedents later kings used eagerly: standard laws, firm coinage control, regional integration, royal oversight of reeves, balanced use of diplomacy and military pressure. These were not temporary measures. They became part of English kingship. Edmund's reign marks a cultural shift we rarely talk about, a transition from heroic kingship to administrative kingship. The older style emphasized battlefield glory, personal vengeance, and dramatic triumphs. The new style, the one Edmund embodied, emphasized order, governance, and foundational stability. He was one of the first English kings who behaved like a modern monarch in some ways: less warrior chieftain, more nation builder. This shift often escapes attention because it lacks spectacle. But imagine medieval Europe without this transition. Imagine England ruled only by dramatic conquerors and impulsive warriors. The very idea of a stable monarchy, of predictable governance, would be inconceivable. Edmund didn't just rule a kingdom, he taught it how to function. Who was Edmund truly? Chronicles give us only fragments. He was fair, he was disciplined, he was capable of mercy and capable of harshness. He wrote laws with a clarity unusual for the age. He traveled constantly, refusing isolation in royal halls. He kept advisors close, but never let them rule in his name. But every fragment reveals something important. Edmund was a king without theatrics. In an age of dramatic personalities, he was calm. In an age of impulsiveness, he was methodical. In an age of personal glory, he focused on collective order. We often assume that staying out of legend means insignificance, but Edmund shows the opposite. A king can shape history profoundly without becoming mythic. When Edmund's sons came of age, they inherited a kingdom prepared for their leadership. Edgar, especially, built upon his father's foundations. He expanded monasteries. He strengthened the legal code. He refined the administrative coherence Edmund initiated. And later, chroniclers glorified Edgar as one of the greatest English kings. But Edgar's success was planted by Edmund. This is the challenge of historical memory. Sometimes the planter is forgotten while the harvester is praised. But stability does not appear overnight. Nations do not strengthen themselves. Every peaceful reign rests on the shoulders of earlier work. Why does the world forget Edmund? 3 reasons. His reign was short. His death was sudden. And he left few grand stories for chroniclers to dramatize. Battles turn into legend. Miracles become songs. Tragedies become myths. But slow, careful governance rarely becomes poetry. Edmund's achievements were quiet, and quiet achievements fade in a world that rewards spectacle. Yet the deeper you look, the more you see that quiet decisions can echo for centuries. Edmund is a reminder that history's spotlight is narrow, but history's impact is wide. Edmund's life forces us to ask a timeless question. What is real power? Is it conquest? Is it fame? Is it the ability to be remembered? Or is it the ability to shape events long after your name stops being spoken? By that measure, Edmund was powerful indeed. His actions influenced the next generation of English kings, the development of law, the stability of coinage, and the identity of a unified realm. Power is not only in noise, sometimes it's in structure, sometimes it's in restraint. As we approach the end of Edmund's story, we are left with a portrait of a king who ruled in the margins but shaped the center. A man whose youth did not diminish his responsibility. A ruler who believed that a kingdom could be strengthened not by terror, but by coherence. And a leader whose death was tragic, but whose legacy endured. Edmund challenges our assumptions about medieval kingship. He invites us to look beyond spectacle and see the machinery of history, the laws, institutions, structures, and patterns that support everything else. And now, with his life examined, his reforms understood, and his significance restored, we step into the closing chapter. We return for a moment to the hall where Edmund died, not to replay tragedy, but to illustrate how fragile medieval life could be. One moment, a feast, noise, celebration. The next, a confrontation, a sudden clash, a wound from which a king could not recover. Yet even here, even in this grim scene, Edmund's character emerges. He intervened personally to protect a servant, not out of ego, but out of duty. A king who believed he should uphold order even in moments of leisure. That instinct, that reflex toward responsibility, defined his entire reign. And though his life was cut short, the mindset he left behind endured. Monastic communities preserved Edmund's memory in subtle ways. Manuscripts attributed to his reign were carefully copied. Laws he issued were referenced in later codes. Priests prayed for him on royal feast days. And although monks praised his piety, they also admired his orderliness, for monasteries understood better than anyone the value of structure. Many of the monastic reforms that flourished under Edgar were built upon networks strengthened during Edmund's time. He wasn't a monastic reformer himself, but he created the environment where reform could thrive. By the end of the 10th century, England transformed from a vulnerable cluster of regions into a confident, centralized kingdom. This was not the work of one king alone, but Edmund's contribution sits at the heart of this transformation. He turned unity from an idea into a habit. He turned laws from regional customs into national expectations. He made kingship something that could survive a crisis. In that sense, Edmund did not merely rule England, he helped define it. Compared to continental kings, Edmund appears almost modern. Some of his contemporaries ruled through terror. Others collapsed under pressure. Others focused on personal glory rather than national stability. Edmund stands apart. He resembles rulers who came centuries later, kings concerned with administration, not spectacle. Kings who thought in terms of systems, not moments. In this way, Edmund feels like an early version of the monarchs who made England a European power in later centuries. His reign, though brief, sits at a turning point not just in England's history, but in the evolution of medieval monarchy itself. It is easy to praise stability without acknowledging the burden it places on leaders. Edmund carried the weight of repairing a fractured kingdom while still in his early 20s. He navigated rebellion, diplomacy, economic reform, and religious politics, all before reaching the age most people today finish school. Behind the smoothness of his policies lies the strain of responsibility, a strain few can imagine. And yet he bore it without theatrics, without complaint, without indulgence. In that sense, Edmund's greatest achievement is not the unity he preserved, but the maturity he displayed in preserving it. We often forget that Edmund was not just a king. He was a young man with hopes, doubts, and a life that could have unfolded very differently. Chronicles rarely mention his emotions, but they hint at a thoughtful personality, someone who read, listened, and weighed decisions carefully. We remember his policies, but he also laughed, loved, struggled, worried, and felt the weight of expectations. This human side makes his early death even more tragic. It wasn't only England that lost potential. Edmund himself lost the future he was building. Now, after exploring the full arc of his life, we can finally return to the title often given to him in later centuries. Edmund the Magnificent. Not because he conquered lands, not because he inspired epics, but because he strengthened the unseen pillars of a kingdom. Magnificence does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the foundations. Sometimes it lies in the quiet precision of a mind determined to leave things better than he found them. That is Edmund's magnificence. Edmund's life teaches us several lessons still relevant today. Order is not an accident, it is built. Stability is not silent, it is maintained. Legacy is not noise, it is structure. His reign reminds us that leadership can be patient, intentional, and quietly transformative, that the most important changes are sometimes the least flashy, and that nation building is less about heroics than about responsibility. More than 1,000 years have passed since Edmund walked the halls of Winchester. The world he knew has vanished, yet the nation he helped solidify still stands. English law, English governance, and English identity grew from seeds he nurtured. Most great achievements become invisible with time, buried beneath layers of later history. But if we peel back those layers, Edmund's imprint is still there, subtle, enduring, unmistakable. Edmund's story may not dazzle with legendary battles or dramatic conquests, but its importance lies in something deeper. He kept England whole during one of its most vulnerable moments. He guided a fragile, newly unified kingdom through uncertainty. He reinforced the structures that allowed it to grow. And his early death, though tragic, proved the strength of what he built, because England did not collapse without him. He may be forgotten by popular memory, but he should not be. And so, with Edmund's life, death, and legacy now fully in view, we turn to the broader implications of his reign and what they reveal about leadership, identity, and the fragile beginnings of nations. After Edmund, England increasingly saw itself not as a collection of kingdoms, but as one realm. That idea strengthened, evolved, and eventually became unshakable. Later kings could expand, reform, and reshape, but the core identity, one people, under one crown, had taken hold. Foundations are the least glamorous part of history, yet they are the most important. Without foundations, empires crumble. Without stability, laws mean nothing. Without structure, unity dissolves. Edmund understood this instinctively, or perhaps experientially, growing up in the aftermath of decades of raids and political chaos. He knew what fragmentation felt like, and he spent his reign ensuring England would not experience it again. The medieval world often celebrated loud kings, conquerors, warlords, rulers whose names shook the earth. But history's true strength often lies in its quiet kings, the careful ones, the thoughtful ones, the ones who value continuity over spectacle. Edmund stands among them, not as a legend, but as something more important, a steady hand during a fragile era. By exploring Edmund's story, we restore a missing piece of England's early narrative. We bring back into focus a king who shaped the centuries that followed, even if his name slipped into the margins. History is not just about what is remembered, it's also about what deserves remembering. In a world that celebrates noise, Edmund's calm competence feels refreshing. His story reminds us that greatness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it works quietly, patiently in the background, yet its effects echo for generations. Whether you discovered Edmund today for the first time, or rediscovered him in greater detail, I hope his life offers a new perspective on how nations are built, not only through heroism, but through responsibility, through structure, through the kind of leadership that endures beyond the spotlight. We owe Edmund more than memory. We owe him recognition for the stability he built, a stability that shaped the English identity for centuries. His reign reminds us that history's quiet architects often leave the deepest marks. And so, as we close this chapter of England's early past, We honor Edmund, a young king who preserved a fragile kingdom, strengthened its foundations, and ensured its future. A king history nearly lost, but whose legacy was far too important to forget. Thank you for joining this journey into the quiet brilliance of Edmund's reign. May his story remind us that even the faintest voices in history can shape the loudest futures.